Our story begins with a great emperor analyzing important documents. He had received a report from the minister that contained information about the upcoming events that would be relevant to the dynasty. Finally, the time had come once again for the selection of the emperor's companions, something that only happened every 3 years in the empire. And the person responsible for this selection was the empress. However, lately she had not been fulfilling the agreements very well. In fact, the woman was far more occupied training her sword skills, or doing anything else that did not involve her husband's harem. Just thinking about this, Xiao Jinyun crushes the leaflet in anger, but his servant tries to calm him down, explaining that it would be better to have a friendly conversation with the empress so that things would not go wrong when the event arrived. Because of this, the young man decided to go to the Fengyi Palace, finding the girl exactly as he thought he would, busy training with her sword in the garden. He arrives suddenly, catching her a little off guard, and the two exchange far from friendly looks. After all, who would like to waste time choosing companions for their own husband? Without ceremony, the young man throws her a list of concubine candidates whose families were strong enough to benefit the court in some way, ordering his wife to choose the candidates according to that report, to which she responds with irony, laughing and asking whether he did not trust her intuition. This makes the young man grind his teeth. Intuition? He remembered 3 years ago when he had handed her the same type of report, and all he had asked was that Yu Shu choose candidates who could benefit the court in some way, favoring the daughters of important officials. But of course, the girl did not follow that path. In reality, what she did was choose the ugliest women in the empire, arguing that since they would not be able to seduce the young man, he would not fall madly in love with them, and that this would be very good for the court. Impatient, the empress dismisses that stupid document, saying that the Council of Noble Ladies was now responsible for administering the 6 harems. So, if he did not trust her abilities enough, he could ask them for help. Xiao Jinyun could not stand these evasions from his wife. Because of that, he pinned her against a stone, ordering her not to test his patience. It was incredible how he could look so handsome even while trying to threaten her like that. Yu Shu was nervous with all that closeness, and in the heat of the moment, pushed Xiao Jinyun with all her strength, but she definitely did not expect that push to send him flying away. Realizing she had made a huge mistake, the girl runs to try to save him, grabbing onto his clothes to stop the emperor from falling. But to her misfortune, she falls along with him into the lake beside them, sinking deeply. God knows how long they stayed submerged. But when the emperor woke up, he found himself staring at a ceiling full of dragon embroidery. He turns to the side, noticing the presence of his mother in the room. However, when he called out to her, he noticed something was very wrong. His voice was deep like a man's. And, frightened, he decided to check under the covers, only to confirm what he already suspected. The emperor was, in reality, the empress, who had awakened in the body of the husband she so deeply rejected. The girl could not believe it, but she had to pretend everything was normal when the young man's mother approached, saying that the physician had already examined him and that he was fine. He just needed to rest for the rest of the night. With a firm look, the woman also asked him not to worry about the empress, because she herself would take care of that. It was hard to hear someone speaking about her like that and say nothing. Even so, she did her best not to draw attention, saying that everything was fine and asking the woman, who was now theoretically her mother, to go rest. And so she does. Yu Shu was devastated. How had that happened? And to make matters worse, one of her servants entered the room, interrupting her thoughts to announce that the Council of Noble Ladies had gone to the palace and was requesting a visit with the young man. But the girl had no head for that now, so she simply ordered them to be dismissed. Yu Shu paced in circles around the room, trying to think of what to do, when finally a thought occurred to her. If she had taken over the emperor's body, then that meant he had taken over her body? Nervous, the girl decided to act and clear this up once and for all. So she put on her shoes and went out shouting for the guards to prepare to go to the Fengyi Palace. As soon as they arrived there, the atmosphere was ominous. The emperor, now in Yu Shu's body, did not say a single word. And when Xiao Jinyun arrived there, he realized that the expression on the young man's face was the same one he used to have in his original body when he was about to explode. Because of that, while massaging his mother's shoulders, he asked her to go rest, since it was already getting late, making it clear that he would stay a little while with the empress. It did not take long for a deafening silence to settle between the two of them. Yu Shu was nervous while the emperor remained impassive. The girl shifted back and forth, asking what they should do. And the first thing the young man said was that she needed to stop moving her hips like a girl when talking to him. After thinking for a long time, the woman suggested that they try to repeat exactly what had happened at the lake. So the two of them tried everything, running around the room, crashing into the wall to see if they would pass out, and even throwing themselves into the same lake again. But nothing worked. In the end, they only ended up completely soaked and with their bodies swapped in the same way as before. Zhao Jinyun could not believe it, and he did not even want to bother talking to the emperor to make him come back to his senses. So all he did was ask her to go to court the next day in his place. After all, now she was the emperor, and considering the failed attempts to return to normal, that was all they could do. Yushu jumps up immediately, being pulled out of her trance of self-deprecation, asking what he meant by wanting her to go to court. He was completely crazy. However, calm as always, the emperor replies that she came from a very important family, full of serious officials who served the empire. So asserting herself should not exactly be a problem. Except it was. Since they could not waste time, he grabs the girl by the arm, saying that he needed to give her etiquette training so she could act like an emperor, something that would be a true torture for the girl. The next day, there was no way around it. The new emperor had to attend the court meeting early in the morning. Until then, she had no idea how exhausting that was. First, because she could not understand a single thing those people were saying. That was because they always spoke all mixed up, one over the other. Those men could not be civilized enough to disagree about something without making a mess. Deep down, Yushu only wished they would start behaving like normal, civilized people. That was when she remembered the brief training she had with Xiao Jinyun the day before, when he handed her several documents she needed to be aware of before the meeting. When the girl asked what she should do if she did not understand what people were saying, the young man replied that she just needed to ask to postpone the matter, because the best thing to do when she could not keep up with the conversation was to request a report to analyze later and let those people fight among themselves. Thus, she reclined in the emperor's chair, acknowledging that she was far too tired to keep breaking up fights between old men like those. It took a while before one of her servants called her attention, since the emperor was drooling while sleeping. Apparently, the discussion had already ended, and her servant explains that the two ministers were just waiting for the young man's instructions. Embarrassed, Yushu asks them to let her change her clothes first, leaving that suffocating room immediately, and leaving everyone without understanding anything. Yushu felt as if her heart were jumping out of her chest, and she arrived begging for a little water when she found Xiao Jinyun, still in her body. She managed to act like a natural lady. It was truly impressive. He, on the other hand, could not do the same and just pulled the cup from the new empress's hand in desperation, drinking all the water there was to calm his nerves, before asking how she should respond to the minister's questions. Enigmatic as always, Xiao Jinyun asks what she thought she should answer, but the girl was completely exhausted, remembering that it was he who had said she only needed to ask about things that had to be decided immediately. As he realized that the discussion was going nowhere, Xiao Jinyun then tells the girl to tell the ministers that neither of them was wrong in the situation, and to ask for a report so they could discuss the matters more thoroughly in the future. Thus, the morning council finally ended, leaving the young one completely destroyed. She was exhausted, and it was not even lunchtime yet, but her spouse entered the room ordering her to get up, because there was a pile of reports to analyze. She could not believe that this work never ended. Trying to find some peace, she wrapped herself in the blanket, telling Xiao Jinyun to handle all of that, because she would not lift a single finger. And she received a piercing glare in return, as usual, but there was not much else to be done. So the young man, in his new body, settled into the chair to evaluate the reports. He watched Yushu sleeping deeply with a bit of envy, which made him give a small sideways smile. Indeed, he had married an adorable woman. The Empress spent the entire afternoon filling out documents and analyzing those reports. When she finally finished, it seemed as if she had lost several nights of sleep. Meanwhile, the useless emperor spent the entire day snoring in her ear. Carefully, the Empress woke him up, asking Xiao Jinyun to get up and receive his mother. In response, all he did was turn his face toward the pillow and refuse. But there was no escaping this one. So the girl practically dragged him like a child to the other pavilion. It did not take long for the two of them to be announced in the room of the late emperor's widow. And as always, the woman received the Empress with a piercing glare, while the poor girl only tried to guide Xiao Jinyun so that he would not do anything foolish. The lady rushed toward him, asking if her son was all right. He confirmed it, even though he felt a very strange atmosphere between the two women. But the truth was that he was extremely uncomfortable. He could not even pull his hand back because that old woman was clinging to it desperately. In the middle of all that interaction, the Empress merely stared at the widow, who always cast looks of disdain at Yushu, regardless of the situation. Completely cold, the widow questioned why her daughter-in-law had not gone to speak with her in the morning, since that was a sign of respect within the empire. If she were honest, she would have answered that she did not know she had to do that at that time. That was because when Xiao Jinyun still had his own body and was no longer acting as Yushu, he spent his mornings at the council, so he did not have that obligation to fulfill. But now, as empress, that was her duty. When the old woman finally released her son's hand, Xiao Jinyun realized he needed to do something. After all, his husband, or rather his wife, was arguing with his mother, and he could not just stand there doing nothing, right? So, in a quick gesture to try to save the poor girl, he explained that the empress was still somewhat unsettled because of the accident from the previous day, making it clear that it was he who had asked her not to go speak with his mother early in the morning, and he apologized to the lady for not having informed her beforehand, putting an end to the matter. The widow's expression completely changed when she addressed her son. The two of them chatted cheerfully as if nothing had happened. Yu Shu, on the other hand, stared at that scene somewhat shocked. She knew it was not the first time something like that had happened. However, she could not remember how she had treated her own wife in those situations, because she did not think she had helped her in such a loving way before. What a catch, huh? Sometime later, the two were alone and bored in their quarters, when the Empress shot the young man a piercing glare and asked why he was following her around like a headless chicken, something that left Xiao Jinyun a bit confused, but Yu Shu soon explained that this was her palace now. After all, the two of them had switched bodies and needed to keep up appearances. Meanwhile, all she could imagine was her husband messing everything up in the place that used to be her home. She knew that if she went back to the Zikin Palace to sleep, the worst could happen. Because of that, she gave in, telling the young man to forget what she had said earlier. The two of them go together to another wing of the palace, being received by the countless servants of the empire. While Xiao Jinyun swept the place with his eyes, Yu Shu seemed far less excited about all of it. It did not take long for the young man's eyes to shine mischievously, and he called the poor girl's attention as she could no longer stand having to share the same space as her husband. The young man joked, saying that he was very thirsty and wanted to drink a special dragon tea made by his wife's own hands. The girl could not believe she was hearing that. What a shameless guy. So, trying not to give in to Xiao Jinyun's provocations, she ordered the servants to go prepare that tea for His Majesty. However, one of the maids trembled as she confronted the Empress, saying that the Emperor had said he wanted Yu Shu herself to make the drink. It was not as if she could argue with them over that small insolence. After all, it was the truth. Extremely stressed, the woman placed the cup on the table for the young man to drink. She ground her teeth nonstop, and I am sure she was hoping he would burn himself with the boiling liquid. A few days later, a very interesting piece of news spread throughout the empire. The new topic among the noblewomen of the harem was the fact that the emperor had finally spent a night with his wife. What those people did not know, however, was that they had ended up trapped in the worst night of their lives. Yu Shu even told the guy to sleep on the floor because his face alone was enough to give her terrible dreams. However, he retorted, saying that the emperor had finally realized how ugly his face truly was. After all, he was still in his body. During the night, the empress watched her own husband shivering with cold on the floor, and with a bit of compassion, she allowed him to return to the bed and sleep beside her. But they truly did nothing more than that. Not even a cuddle happened. The next day, the maids prepared the two of them as usual, before they split up so that Xiao Jinyun could attend the council, while his wife would go to the Dowager Empress's chambers. Being in that environment was truly unbearable for the young man. If he were honest, it was far more interesting to think about what was happening to Yu Shu than to deal with all those men arguing. He was very worried about how she might be treated, and how she would react to being mistreated by her mother-in-law. The girl entered the room with a sour expression, only to be surprised by one of the harem ladies, who asked whether the reason for her delay was the night she had spent awake with the emperor. That scene was downright ridiculous. The woman was massaging her mistress's shoulders like a complete sycophant. However, Yu Shu would not give in. She was firm as she asked how she dared to speak to her like that, reminding her that she was the queen of that empire. That was enough to make the envious woman lower her head and greet her formally. Still, she could not help but wonder why the girl was acting in such an insolent way, since apparently Yu Shu usually just lowered her head at any remark. But now, all our girl did was ignore the noblewoman's greeting. The widow decided to interfere, questioning whether her daughter-in-law had gone there so early just to challenge her and show her dominance in the empire. That surprised her a little. In the past, when he was still in his original body, Xiao Jinyun believed his mother was a sweet person toward his wife, even if they had disagreements. So he had no idea she behaved in such a different way when he was not there. Thus, even though she felt wronged, all she did was lower her head and apologize. The widow's niece, however, did not back down. She simply took the opportunity to needle the girl, saying that she had always been like that, somewhat temperamental. It was not the first time she had behaved that way, but the girl was not going to let that slide. She would never allow herself to be interrupted like that, and so she scolded the other woman. It was downright absurd, considering that this had never happened when he was emperor. It seemed it took a body swap for the guy to discover that sexism exists. He had not known his cousin could be so arrogant since until then he firmly believed she was a very gentle and graceful woman. However, that show of authority served for nothing, since in the end, Yu Shu only received more shouting from the widow. But she was saved by the gong when one of the servants interrupted the two, saying that the emperor urgently requested his wife's company. She could not believe she was being saved by Xiao Jinyun once again. When they finally met, the young man was very nervous. He knew the girl would not be able to hold back and would eventually explode at his mother. But what worried him was how he would deal with that in the future, when their bodies returned to normal, so he asked her to come see him right away. The next day, during the council, things continued the same. Xiao Jinyun was also exhausted and frankly was only there because he was forced to be. It was always the same thing. The men spent the entire morning stirring up intrigue among themselves and left without any answers to their issues. This time, he even tried to intervene, asking the Prime Minister and General Chen to stop arguing and shouting at each other. But of course, that did nothing, since apparently the ministers there did not respect the emperor very much. After an entire morning of shouting, the two went to Xiao Jinyun's office, making the same mess as before. Extremely tired, the young man slammed his hand on the table to get their attention, shouting for them to stop fighting and asking if they thought they were in the middle of a marketplace to act that way. That was finally enough to put an end to their little quarrel. While the minister lowered his head, the general took the opportunity to explain that his army was running out of food. Therefore, if His Majesty did not increase investment in the military, it would impact their success in the frontier battle. And he was willing to raise that money at any cost, even if he had to fight with his own hands against the Prime Minister. But the gentleman did not agree with that at all, explaining that there was a very large amount of land for cultivation where the army was stationed, so food should not be a problem. However, the general disagreed. That was not true for him because it was not possible to plant that much food in such a short time and without manpower. Otherwise, his men would not have tried to stage a rebellion because of it. But the Prime Minister certainly did not see things that way. More calmly, the emperor interrupted the conversation between the two, saying that what General Shen had said made a lot of sense. After all, the soldiers did not have proper training to plant anything at all. In addition, autumn had arrived, and the frontier would only get colder and colder. Therefore, it would be good to send them some winter clothes. That was enough to leave the military man speechless, and he thanked the emperor for his generosity. Later, in their quarters, the young man gave his report to Yu Shu, who was surprised by the fact that the general stopped lamenting and complaining. She knew him well enough to know that the man was very proud of the things he had achieved with his army, and he believed that the emperor was nothing more than a young man ignorant of matters of war. So he ended up being quite direct and aggressive with his words almost all the time. The boy savored his favorite biscuits while he spoke, explaining that this had happened precisely because General Chen was a military man. They were all far too stubborn, but they eventually gave in, and his comment left Yu Shu thoughtful. Before she asked whether the young man knew the real reason the two of them had married years ago, but she herself answered that it was because the boy wanted to take advantage of the military power of her late father, which he did not take as an offense. And the boy fell silent. He did not even know if there was anything to say at that moment, while the girl explained that he had ascended the throne when he was still a teenager, so his position had not been exactly stable before. And even if the girl swore loyalty to her family, he could not trust her words blindly. At that time, he did not know why Yu Shu did not trust them, but now he could fully understand. Before they ended the conversation, Xiao Jinyun surprised his wife by saying that it was not so easy to distinguish which subordinates were loyal or not. Then he acknowledged that if he were in her place, he also would not trust a stranger's family very much. The following night, when the two of them attended more than one of the Empire's events, the women were enchanted by Xiao Jinyun's presence as usual. All of them were beautiful women who made a point of showing their interest in the emperor, and he also loved spending time with them, enjoying the affection and attention he received. It was as if he were a puppy being petted from all sides. The empress, on the other hand, was not very excited about the situation, and she shouted, wanting to know if she had heard her servant's words correctly, who repeated that the emperor had asked him to inform her that he would be sleeping together with his ladies-in-waiting that night. The anger was so great that the girl broke her cup into pieces with her own hands, before running out of the room, burning with rage. She was certain that Xiao Jinyun would cause some problem that she would have to solve in the future when she returned to her body. She definitely did not want to deal with another woman in love with him and desperate for affection. However, in the middle of the night, the emperor surprised her by arriving very drunk in Yu Shu's room, jumping into her arms in a desperate hug. Nevertheless, the woman made a point of pushing him away before asking why he had decided to come back early. And with his usual mockery, he decided it was a great moment for a provocation, asking whether the woman might have missed him. He pinned her against the wall, trying to seduce her by calling her beautiful and asking what her name was, as if the two of them had not known each other for years. But what Yushu replied was that he was acting in a very narcissistic way and questioned whether he did not feel ashamed of seducing himself. He moved closer, ignoring all of the girl's words and saying that he liked that bold attitude of hers, which was exactly like Xiao Jinyun's. That was Xiao Jinyun's old name, and he could not believe that the girl would strike such a low blow, so he pushed her away, shouting that she was nothing but a crazy woman. But he sighed, embracing the Empress's body and confessing that he had liked Xiao Jinyun since he was just a little boy. He remembered how he spent hours watching the Emperor from afar and how he had always had the desire to marry him. But who could have guessed that he would become a completely different person? That left the girl somewhat stunned. What did he mean they had known each other since they were young? However, when she realized that the young man who was still leaning against her body had fallen asleep, she tried to wake him at any cost, asking him to talk more about that story. However, Xiao Jinyun only fell, knocking the poor girl down with him onto the mattress, unable to move because of his size. The next day, some rumors spread through the harem about the young man being interested only in the Empress's company and love. The women were clearly nervous, and those who were not were dejected for having no chance at all with the young man. His cousin was the first to stir up trouble, questioning what they would do now that Xiao Jinyun spent every day at the Fengyi Palace with his wife. While sobbing with sadness, one girl said that the night before he had even gone to her palace, but only drank a glass of wine before running into his wife's arms, something her friend agreed with, commenting that he had gifted her a new harp, but only listened to her play one song before leaving. Impatient, the young man's cousin made it clear that she would not accept this, and she had a great plan to put into action. Now more than ever, the women of the harem needed to strive to find even more beautiful women when the time came for the selection of new ladies-in-waiting. On the day of the ceremony, the young man felt chills from head to toe. He had no idea what might happen. He only observed the many women lined up just waiting to be called, while the Empress observed them attentively. They smiled, showed their talents in art, music, and anything else that might please the empire. But Xiao Jinyun seemed tired of all of it. At least now that she was occupying her wife's body, she could control the selection of women according to her strategies. She remained so cold that Jili's cousin was surprised by the Empress's behavior, and she called her attention with a smile, commenting on how beautiful the candidates were. But she was ignored once again. Yushu had written down a few names, and she already thought she had enough candidates. Thus, she drew her husband's attention, who had been talking with his mother until then, whispering in his ear that those women would be very good for the court, so he should choose a few among them. So the young man took the report, quickly analyzing the names, before standing up to make his decision, establishing absolute silence in the hall. But he was not delicate at all when pointing at them and stating their flaws. He simply went on pointing out that one was very ugly, another was too tanned, and there was one who simply was not his type. In the end, not a single woman remained as a good candidate, which made all the noble women think one thing. Apparently, the emperor was truly completely lost over his wife. The entire court was shocked when the young man chose no one from the concubine selection, arguing that having an empty harem would be terrible for the court, but Xiao Jinyun did not seem to care much about that. I myself do not know how they manage so many people together. And he asked those women to be silent for a moment so they could understand what was going on, revealing that the situation on the battlefield was becoming increasingly intense. Moreover, the country's reserves were already running out, and the men at the frontier were losing their own homes because of how difficult things were. Therefore, he believed it would be imprudent to expand the harem at such a complicated moment. Although I think Xiao Jinyun did not believe a single word he said, it worked to make the women see him as a very wise man. They bowed before him and thanked him for his care for the nation. While checking his reports later, the young man tried to understand why his wife had not yet returned. He even tried to pass the time by drawing, since reading those documents was very boring. But the truth was that he was very, very bored, and he asked his servant where the Empress was, to which he replied that she had gone to show respect to the widow, as always, in the morning, but had not yet returned. That was enough to make the man jump out of his chair. The morning council had already ended, and even so, the old woman still had not released her. That could only mean that something very bad had happened, considering Yushu's foul mouth. He could imagine her flipping the furniture in the room, completely stressed, and even the punishment she would receive for such disobedience. Worried, Xiao Jinyun decided to intervene, calling one of his maids. and ordered her to find out what was happening in the widow's chambers, stressing that if she happened to see the two arguing, she should inform him immediately. And so she did. Meanwhile, Yushu was talking with her mother-in-law, explaining that the emperor was very shaken by the matters of the council, so she thought it would be better if his mother made the decision of choosing his new companions, something the lady agreed with, and even praised her daughter-in-law, saying that she had finally matured. The atmosphere between the two was harmonious, which was not common at all, but only between the two of them because the other women of the harem were completely outraged by what had happened the previous day. In the midst of this, the maid discreetly peeked through the door, concluding that, fortunately, she probably would not need to summon His Majesty there. A flashback from 3 years ago comes to mind when a major argument broke out within the emperor's family. The widow pointed at Yushu, shouting, asking how she had dared to choose women like those to accompany her man. But the girl did not pay much attention to the attacks of that bitter woman. That was when the Council of Noble Ladies entered the palace, always mocking her face, whispering things into the widow's ear, as if they were planning the girl's coffin. Thinking about it, they had never treated Yushu like a human being, and all of that was out of pure envy. But while the girl was thinking about this, her husband was in the office, pacing back and forth, dying of anxiety. He seemed to be eagerly awaiting the arrival of anyone there. That was when Prince Xiao Jinming was finally announced by the servants, making Xiao Jinyun shout for them to bring him in immediately. But he had to pause for a moment to remember exactly who that young man was. He was a very relevant man to the empire, for he was the emperor's brother, and the two had a fairly good relationship. Yushu considered him a very handsome man, and remembered that he was always smiling aimlessly at women. He was indeed charming, at least with women, because with his brother, he was completely different. Because of that, he burst in noisily, shouting for the young man at the top of his lungs, before bumping into him, stumbling and almost knocking him to the ground. But luckily, he managed to hold him before the worst happened. Poor Yushu had to make a great effort to remind herself that, since she was in Xiao Jinming's brother's body, it was fine for them to hug like that. But the hug was soon interrupted when she noticed the young man clinging to Xiao Jinyun's legs, crying and begging him to lend him some money. She could not believe she was really going through yet another ordeal like that. The girl did not understand why the guy behaved that way in front of his brother, but somewhat awkwardly, she simply asked how much money they were talking about, to which Xiao Jinming replied that he needed 8. Trying to clarify things, Xiao Jinyun asked whether he needed 800 coins. Even though that was not a very high amount, it was strange because, considering he was a prince, he should not be lacking money. The problem was that he was lacking quite a lot, apparently, since the young man added that he needed 8,000, tightening the hug even more. And not just 8,000, but 8,000 gold coins. Xiao Jinyun desperately did the math in his head to understand exactly how much money that was. And, realizing it was a much larger amount than usual, he shook his brother in his arms, wanting to know why he needed so much money. The young man then replied that their mother's birthday was approaching, and he had found the perfect gift he wanted to give her. That answer was enough to make Xiao Jinyun tremble with rage. While Xiao Jinming continued explaining that, a few days earlier, he had lost his entire fortune. With a psychopathic smile on his face and pretending to be friendly, the emperor then asked who his brother had lost so much money to, and he revealed that it had been to one of his uncles. That particular relative was well known throughout the empire as the Third Prince. The man spent his time very busy on the battlefields. He had even fought alongside the general a few times, and he himself acknowledged that the Third Prince was very skilled in combat, a clearly extraordinary person. But what did not make sense to Xiao Jinyun was what exactly he was planning to do with all that money he had obtained from other people. Trying to maintain his patience without any success, Xiao Jinyun explained that this man was a complete ruffian, shouting at his brother that he behaved like a puppy that had fallen off the moving cart. But now that he was the emperor, he knew it was no use just getting angry and complaining to Xiao Jinming. He had to resolve things. So the young man ordered him to go to the Qian Palace to summon his sister-in-law so that they could help him buy the gift. And so he did, being announced at the palace of the two women, who soon let him in. Xiao Jinming arrived calmer than when he had met his brother, greeting the women carefully. However, he was surprised to encounter his sister-in-law's cold and distant gaze. After all, he did not know that the one inhabiting her body was, in fact, his dear brother. The two exchanged intense looks briefly, and Xiao Jinming could not help wondering why the girl's gaze reminded him so much of his brother's. But that moment was interrupted by his mother, who smiled kindly, asking him to come closer. The noble women who were there were completely smitten with the prince, who could not help but comment that his visit seemed to be greatly pleasing the concubines present. This made the woman's expression harden immediately as she dismissed all of them. Thus, The Empress and the concubines bid the two farewell. However, before the Empress could leave the room, the prince whispered to her that it was his brother who had sent him there to save her from the situation. Yushu did not fully understand what he meant by that, but the young man cast her a knowing look. He was satisfied now that he was alone with his mother, and it did not take long for him to start acting like the spoiled child he was, saying that he wanted walnut cake for a snack. The woman pinched his cheeks as if he were 2 years old, saying that she already knew he would ask for that and that she would take care of it. As she walked, the prince's words echoed in Yushu's mind. "My brother asked me to save you." This made her smile genuinely, thinking about the care her husband could have for her, at least until she saw the situation they were in. The poor man kept drawing the turtle over and over, lamenting at the desk and wondering why the woman had not returned yet. Suddenly, she threw a pile of materials on top of him and he asked what that was. Then the girl explained that since the emperor's mother's birthday was approaching, she had asked Yushu to make a piece of clothing with embroidery of a character that symbolized longevity. The problem was that even in her normal body, she was a terrible seamstress. She even wondered why her husband had not refused the gift, but it made sense. He did not want to worsen the relationship between the two of them. The next day, Prince Xiao Jinming ran to speak with his brother. Apparently, bothering him was one of his favorite activities in the world, but he ended up being surprised by the sight of Xiao Jinyun embroidering the gift for the widow. That was definitely anticlimactic. He did not expect that at all. Xiao Jinyun did not quite know what to say. After all, he did not have a very plausible excuse for embroidering in the middle of the day, but he explained that he had simply grown curious about the activity, making it clear that it was the Empress who had done the embroidery already on the fabric the night before. Of course, his brother did not believe a single word of what he said. However, he did not want to waste more time on such things, so he questioned the reason for their meeting this time, which seemed to catch Xiao Jinming off guard as he became very assertive, extending his hand and demanding that the young man hand over his 8,000 gold coins. However, our boy immediately slapped his hand away, telling him to stop acting entitled because he did not have that money. Disappointed, the young man began to cry like a real child, saying that he had promised the day before. But Xiao Jinyun was not moved at all by all those tears. He had more important things to do. The third Duke of the royal family had requested an audience with him, so he withdrew to meet the man who had disappointed him with all due formality. But the young man asked him not to be so ceremonious. After all, he was his uncle. He was disappointed, in truth, because he could not understand how that man had the nerve to take money from people younger than himself. Outside the meeting room, the prince tried to listen to the entire conversation between the two. He heard when the Duke asked what he wanted, questioning whether there was anything he could do for his nephew while smiling kindly. Without any further beating around the bush, the young man explained that he had heard that Xiao Jinming had lost all his money to his uncle in a match and wanted to know if that was true. Somewhat awkwardly, the man laughed, saying that he had only done it to provoke him. Apparently that had worked, because behind the door, Xiao Jinming wondered why he had not returned his money then. But his brother was more concerned with other things, arguing that since he had enough free time to be playing around, the two of them could do that together, and he drew his bow. That surprised the man a little, who explained that His Majesty had many things to do, so he did not need to lower himself to his level since he was just a minister. But the young man made it clear that he was not offering for them to play dice or cards. He wanted to propose an archery competition. The man observed this very carefully before taking his nephew's bow and questioned him, because he remembered that he had never shown much interest in horseback riding or shooting, so he wanted to know where that motivation was coming from now. Without answering him, however, the young man asked whether he accepted the challenge or not, because if he won, he would give him one of his mansions located in the imperial capital. However, if the opposite happened, the man would be required to return Xiao Jiming's money. The Duke thought for a moment before accepting, arguing that since he wanted to defend his brother, he would not oppose it. Realizing where that whole story was heading, Xiao Jinming regretted it a little. He knew he was screwed because his brother would end up losing all the money as well. When they were children, he had even tried archery, but he was a disaster. He missed the targets almost every time, and the arrows almost always landed outside the circle. He could already see how that would end, and it was embarrassing. Even so, the two of them headed to the training grounds, with a clear tension in the air. His uncle went first, drawing the bow while watching his opponent out of the corner of his eye. And as expected, he hit all 3 arrows straight into the target. Now it was Xiao Jinyun's turn to prove himself. He did not seem intimidated in the slightest. After all, in his body now was Yu Shu, and she had good weapons training. Thus, he began to aim carefully, letting the arrow fly, and surprising everyone there with his perfect aim. The young man showed no fear or anything like that, only concentration. As he hit arrow after arrow right in the center of the target, his uncle was completely dumbfounded. He did not know how that was possible. Mockingly, Xiao Jinyun turned around, noticing the shock on the man's face, who gave an awkward laugh, saying that the boy had hit dead center, and confessed that he was impressed. With his victory declared, there was nothing else to be done, except to return the box of precious items that Xiao Jinming owned, something that left the prince extremely grateful. However, he could not stop thinking about one thing. His brother had always been very bad at archery, so he did not understand how he had won, but the young man brushed it off, saying that he had trained a lot recently. It was a terrible time for Xiao Jinming to decide to be clever. To the young man, that situation was, at the very least, strange. And he pointed out something else his brother claimed to have learned, the embroidery that his sister-in-law supposedly had made. A sister-in-law who was very busy reading documents, as always, until she finally noticed the two of them there and asked what they were plotting. Xiao Jinming made a startled expression. He kept alternating between looking at her face and at his brother without stopping. That was when he finally discovered the reason for all of that. Certainly poor Xiao Jinyun had completely lost his mind. Little did he know that, for the couple, the crazy one in this situation was the prince. As the young man's stay dragged on, he could not ignore the fact that his brother had been acting very strangely lately. Maybe it was because of the concubine selection, with the empress meddling in his affairs. Maybe he had not managed to choose any other woman to be his, which was probably leaving him very stressed. Noticing that he was being watched, Xiao Jinyun asked what his brother was doing. Then the prince invited him to go out of the palace for a bit, which caught the young man by surprise. It was hard for him to remember that he was now a man, so he had the freedom to come and go inside or outside the empire. So he went out dragging poor Xiao Jinming along. On the streets, there were many people coming and going, paying visits and engaging in commerce. All of that was fascinating and very new to the girl. Still in her beloved's body, he observed everything around him with a certain joy, especially the food there, which looked very delicious. He had never been so happy. However, Xiao Jinming's plans were bigger than that, so he whispered in his brother's ear that he had a very interesting place to show him. But before revealing it, he asked him to promise that he would not hit the poor guy. Only then could he do that. But for that, Xiao Jinyun needed to know what they were talking about. Covering his face with a biscuit, the young man pointed toward the door of the brothel, where several seductive women were calling out to him amid smiles. That was enough to make Xiao Jinyun drop his brother's food out of sheer embarrassment. Even though it seemed absurd, his brother dragged him into the brothel without thinking twice. Xiao Jinming seemed extremely comfortable in that environment. Seriously, it was as if he went there every day to buy bread or something like that. And one of the women smiled, commenting that it had been a long time since the last time she had seen him there, as if she missed his company. Which made the emperor curious because he did not seem to know that Xiao Jinming was a regular customer of that place. His thoughts were interrupted when one of the women offered the young man something to drink, and he accepted. After all, he was already there, and it did not seem like it would be a short visit. From then on, it was all wins for Xiao Jinyun, who was fed by the woman with great affection. He felt incredible. He was starting to understand why men liked visiting those brothels so much. Upon seeing the emperor so happy, Xiao Jinming concluded that, looking at the situation from that angle, the young man seemed quite normal. He only came back to his senses when the lady beside him insisted on calling his name several times. Smiling, the prince turned to ask what had happened, and the woman informed him that Peony was trying to speak with him. Upon hearing that name, he lifted his eyes, looking for its owner. She was delicately playing a melody on her harp, displaying her talent for everyone to hear. She approached, saying that she really wanted to know whether the piece pleased His Highness and the young master who accompanied him. The courtesan cast a look at Xiao Jinyun, who seemed lost in the whole situation. Even so, he simply confirmed that he liked the music very much. However, Peony continued questioning the young man, commenting that the young master seemed to have quite refined taste, and asking what had inspired the melody in question. That was when Xiao Jinyun panicked, thinking about how he could possibly know that. But trying to disguise it, he ended up making up that the melody had left him completely speechless. And surprisingly, that was enough to bring the woman to tears. After the two of them left the place, Xiao Jinming praised his older brother, confessing that he was surprised by the fact that he had become almost a soulmate of the most famous lady-in-waiting of the brothel with just 2 little words. To which the young man replied with a forced smile, saying that he had already gone through too many emotions in a single day. Meanwhile, back at the palace, the empress did not seem pleased at all. That was because she searched for her husband in vain. Questioning her servant about the emperor's whereabouts, something the man revealed already knowing he would have to face the girl's anger. The entire day passed until Xiao Jinyun entered his chambers cheerfully humming, but his expression quickly changed when he saw his wife with a scowl on her face. The woman turned angrily, demanding to know where he had been all that time, to which the emperor replied by whispering in her ear that he had gone to the same place she used to frequent when she still had her original body. Now that he stopped to think about it, the young man did not understand why his spouse sought adventures outside the palace even with so many concubines at her disposal. Consumed by anger, the woman lunged at Xiao Jinyun, forcibly removing his clothes while the poor man questioned what that crazy woman was doing. But she did not answer, and only stopped after making sure that he was clean. The empress, relieved but still disgusted, covered her eyes while making it very clear that her husband was forbidden from going to places like that again. However, the young man retorted, asking why the woman could have several lovers waiting for her outside while he could only stay alone surrounded by the imperial harem, since that was not fair at all. Even so, Yushu defended herself, asking whether he really thought she had any affection for those women, since she only went to the brothel to obtain clues about her important affairs. Xiao Jinyun did not understand, shouting as he asked what kind of information she could possibly get at a brothel, and he told his wife not to even try to make up that some traitor of the empire was hiding there, because that would be too much trickery. Overcome with exhaustion, the girl simply told him to forget it, because she was sure her husband would never understand. There was no point in arguing, because even after all that fight, the emperor would still return to the brothel with his little brother as always. On his next visit, Peony approached the emperor and commented that, although she did not know him very well, she knew he must come from an extraordinary lineage, since the place only received guests of high status, something that caught Xiao Jinyun's interest. She casually mentioned that even the eldest son of the Shu family had already been there, though not just for entertainment, but to hold some business meetings. The revelation surprised our boy, as he had no idea that his older brother frequented that place, much less to conduct business. However, he knew the woman had not said that by accident. Therefore, he asked whether Peony knew whom his brother met with, but she only said that she did not know, justifying that they usually met in secret in the West Chamber, where women were not authorized to serve. Xiao Jinyun, hearing all of this, tried to contain his anger upon hearing such things about his own brother. He knew it was nothing more than a big lie. After all, the prince was far too busy fighting in the war and trying to protect his family. Suspicious, Xiao Jinyun observed his younger brother, who was in the arms of one of the women. At that moment, he was grateful for having taken his spouse's body, because he knew that if she had heard those things, her family would be in danger. Peony watched him attentively while he was lost in thought, until the young man called Xiao Jinming to go with him to the restroom. The next day, in the imperial studio, Xiao Jinyun probed his men to find out what they thought of the Shu family. While the general swore absolute loyalty to his family, the minister revealed that he suspected Marshal Shu might rebel against Your Majesty, considering how much power he held in his hands. Another official also commented that it was hard to say, since the marshal was away most of the time, suggesting that the emperor investigate carefully. That tightened Xiao Jinyun's heart, as he realized that when a lie is told many times, it ends up becoming truth for a good portion of people. Thus, he realized that the rumors painted his family as a threat to the throne, which explained why Xiao Jinyun also did not trust the Shu family. When he tried to talk about this with the empress, he ended up having an unpleasant surprise. The poor girl was having to face her menstrual period for the first time since the body swap, and she seemed quite distressed. Only then did Xiao Jinyun realize that he had forgotten to warn his wife that her period was about to start 2 days earlier. Yushu, horrified by the situation and the humiliation, had an outburst of anger, throwing her stained pillow in the emperor's direction. Xiao Jinyun tried to calm her down and offer clean clothes to the girl, who accepted the help. But as soon as she finished changing, she stormed out, overturning the furniture in the room, indignant at having to endure so much humiliation. Noticing Yushu's anger, Xiao Jinyun decided it was better to talk about his family another time. So he focused on comforting the woman, saying that everything would be fine and that since she had always taken care of her health, she would not have menstrual diarrhea as long as she did not eat anything too cold. But a cold soup had already been served to the poor girl, so it was too late. Now, Yushu was doomed to collapse from so much pain. Xiao Jinyun was quick to hold his wife in his arms and carry her carefully to her bed, despite the girl's embarrassed protests, as she was not used to being in that position. When they finally lay down on the couch, Xiao Jinyun continued with the caresses, asking her to let him warm her up and assuring her that she would feel better soon. Still uncomfortable, Yushu asked how much longer she would feel pain, to which he replied that, normally, one day, while handing her a tea to sip. Playfully, the young man turned to check whether there were still any servants around, before suggesting that the two of them take advantage of the moment to make a child. He could already imagine himself pregnant in the emperor's body, but of course he was scolded by Yushu, who told him to get real. Later, the noblewomen of the harem could only comment on the empress's bad mood, as she tried to read her book in peace. Noticing the empress's discomfort, one of the concubines decided to approach, asking whether everything was all right with your majesty, since she seemed ill. However, Yushu only said that it was nothing serious. She was enjoying the situation, and with a fake smile, she offered to organize the widow's upcoming birthday banquet. Yushu could not believe the girl's audacity. However, she was not about to bow down to a concubine, so she said there was no need to make such a fuss, since she knew how to organize a party. Even so, the girl would not back down, bringing a pile of the empire's accounting books to the girl, trying to humiliate her by saying that if she did not understand them, it was fine. But she did not know that now it was Xiao Jinyun's mind working in that body, and for him, it was very simple to analyze those records quickly, leaving the concubine surprised. Before she threw one of the reports in the woman's face, asking how she explained one of the incorrect accounts listed there, the girl had no idea how the empress had become so intelligent, especially considering that she knew nothing about accounting. Embarrassed, she explained that the servants of the Chengqing Palace usually ignored her, so if she wanted to ask them for anything, she would need more money. Impatient, Yushu ordered that those servants be summoned. The empress glared angrily at all the servants, calling the eunuch and the palace maid to account, demanding to know who would take responsibility for the errors in the financial report. To which the maid replied rudely, saying that perhaps there was no mistake, since the widow's last birthday banquets had been extremely extravagant, and even the lady herself had said she was satisfied with all of them. Furious, Yushu slammed the table, asking how she dared to speak to the emperor that way, correcting herself as she remembered she was no longer in her own body, but without the slightest mercy, ordering that the woman receive 50 lashes. That made the maid scream in shock, begging for mercy as she was dragged out of the room. The concubine watched the scene, completely disgusted. Poor Xiao Jinyun almost ran straight into his wife, but upon noticing her rage, he hid behind the door. She was in an awful mood, leaving the staff trembling with fear. In addition to having left the envious concubine completely stressed because her plan had failed. Meanwhile, by the edge of the Lotus Lake, Xiao Jinyun was relaxing, dipping his feet in the water and enjoying his tea, at least until Yushu approached from behind. Her body seemed to burn with anger as she hurled a book straight at her husband's face, furiously questioning how he used to manage the harem in the past, pointing out the mess those accounts were in. Calmly, Xiao Jinyun removed the book from his head and tossed it aside, retorting that it was not he who had managed the harem before, but rather the emperor's virtuous and gentle cousin. Even though she was extremely stressed, Yushu tried to restrain herself from slapping her husband right then and there, and then insisted on saying that the young man had acted in a very stupid way regarding a very serious matter, questioning how he could allow himself to be intimidated by that woman in such a way. Xiao Jinyun remained silent for a moment, thinking about what to say to her, until he replied that if she had respected her a little more, things would have been much simpler. Upon hearing that, Yushu was left completely speechless. Noticing his wife's silence, Xiao Jinyun turned his head and smiled, telling her not to worry, because he knew the empress was going through those days, so he would forgive her without any problem. But that was the last straw for Yushu, who grabbed her husband by his clothes, saying that she could not take it anymore. As he was dragged along, Xiao Jinyun asked where the empress was taking him, but he received no answer, as Yushu only pulled him in silence to the front gate and pointed upward, indicating the sign of the star-picking palace. That was where the current imperial counselor resided. This counselor knew everything about astronomy and geography, as well as astrology and divination. But more than that, he was also a feast for the eyes. As soon as the couple entered his room, he asked what the problem was. Thus, Yushu began to recount the entire story of their body swap, detailing all the events. But upon hearing the account, the counselor only asked indifferently whether the two of them had swapped bodies. Of course, both nodded. With that confirmation, the man fell silent for a moment, but then he suddenly collapsed onto the floor, rolling from side to side while clutching his stomach and laughing until he cried. Meanwhile, the couple only watched the scene, completely at a loss for words. After a while, the counselor sat up seriously and began shuffling through papers to try to resolve the situation. Meanwhile, Xiao Jinyun watched him curiously and decided to ask the empress what he was doing. And just by observing, Yushu concluded that he was recording the entire story so that he could later use the star charts to calculate the cause of all of it. Hearing that answer, the young man was amazed and moved closer to the counselor to peek at all his astrological workings. However, to him, it all looked like nothing more than a bunch of disordered scribbles. And somewhat offended, he asked the man who the person was that he was referring to as stupid in the drawing. At that, the man gave a dry cough, saying that he needed to step back and stop peeking at what he was doing because it would end up affecting his calculations. His reply left Xiao Jinyun indignant, but before he could say anything, the Empress shoved him aside. She was far more interested in knowing whether the counselor had already found a way to reverse the situation back to normal. However, he only replied that the case was very complex and would require more time to calculate, saying that, in the meantime, it would be best for the two of them to keep everything as it was and continue pretending, which was not exactly the answer they had been hoping for. Completely frustrated, they left the place, and Xiao Jinyun tried to comfort his wife, saying that the counselor would surely find a solution soon. Their walk was interrupted by a very important figure, Beauty Lee. She greeted the two of them formally as soon as she found them. However, Xiao Jinyun did not seem to like her very much. He thought she had become very arrogant since discovering her pregnancy. The Empress, on the other hand, extended her hand toward the girl, commenting on her belly and asking her not to bow like that. However, Beauty Lee recoiled and threw herself to the ground quickly, before she could even be touched, leaving the poor Empress without understanding what was happening. Seeing that scene, Yushu turned pale as if she had seen a ghost. One of the maids quickly rushed to support the poor woman, asking if she was all right. While the Emperor helped her up, the Empress could only stare at the scene in silence, while Beauty Lee had tears in her eyes. Completely fake, she asked why Your Majesty had pushed her like that out of nowhere. Filled with anger, Yushi replied that she had not even touched her, so there was no way she could have pushed her, which seemed to offend the woman, who acted even more dramatically, pressing herself against the Emperor's chest and begging him to defend her. However, Xiao Jinyun was only afraid of what might happen, considering that his wife looked on the verge of exploding. So, trying to get out of that whole situation, he said that since the girl was fine, there was no need to do anything. This set off an alarm in Beauty Lee, who began pretending to be in excruciating pain, screaming while clinging to the poor man. Right in front of them, the Empress also clenched her fists, trying to control herself, until she had a better idea. She shouted for one of her maids to call the royal physician to examine the girl. And so she did, receiving Beauty Lee in the room and looking at her for a moment, while the couple drank tea as they waited for the examination to end. Since Xiao Jinyun had no sense of timing whatsoever, he commented to his wife that it would be good for her to remember that the one who pushed the girl was not him, but her. So when they switched bodies back, he did not want to hear anything about it. Trying to keep calm, the Empress explained that she had done nothing, that he already knew. It was a very old trick of hers. In fact, he remembered when a phoenix-shaped seal of his had disappeared, and everything had been the girl's fault. Their conversation was interrupted when the widow burst into the room, shouting to know what had happened, which only made Yu Shu even more nervous. But she could not even say anything, because the woman's hand flew across her face, as she complained, saying that it had not been easy at all to obtain a royal heir, and now the girl had ruined everything, because she could not behave herself even for a single day. The girl was completely shocked. She had never been struck by the mother like that before, but now she had to accept that she was in her spouse's body, and things were very different. The widow continued, saying that the crime of killing a future member of the royal family was enough to justify the execution of the entire Shu family. Hearing that, the emperor also could not hold himself back, crushing his teacup with his own hands. After some time, the physician came to see them, bowing before His Majesty and confirming the death of the fetus in Beauty Lee's womb. That information was enough to leave the Empress stunned. While the widow only screamed, calling him useless, the emperor did not know what to say. He had not expected the situation to be so serious. After all, the royal heir was now lost, and if this were disclosed, his family would truly be in danger. After a moment of silence, his wife finally spoke up, asking him to summon Dr. Zhang. He was the head of the Imperial Medical Institute and treated only princes and emperors. However, his servant warned that to summon him, a verbal order from the emperor was required. She could not believe she was dealing with sexism for the first time in her life, but she could not simply stand by. So she went up to her husband and told him to issue an order to summon the physician, because she had an idea. Putting on his best emperor posture, Xiao Jinyun asked what was going on and demanded that Chief Physician Zhang be summoned immediately. Thus, his servants moved to comply, while the empress remained indignant. However, the woman stepped forward and ordered that no one move, making it clear that no one was authorized to enter or leave that palace. The emperor knew what his wife was doing and supported her, ordering the servants to do exactly as they had heard. At that moment, one of the servants announced that the Dowager Empress had summoned Yu Shu inside. The emperor took his wife's hand and made it clear that he was with her, which gave her courage, making her feel proud and happy for not being alone at such a delicate moment. Upon entering the room, the two found Li Marin on the bed, lamenting the loss of her child. The widow wore a terrible expression, full of hatred, and as soon as she saw the empress, she made a point of blaming her for that disaster. That scene left Yu Shu overwhelmed with guilt. The widow's rage was so great that it took her a while to notice that her son was also present, wearing a sour expression. She scolded him for being there in the women's chambers, but changed the subject, as she was more concerned about the bad luck that situation might bring, ordering a maid to throw away a bundle containing remnants of medicine. The empress, however, intervened abruptly, forbidding anyone from touching it, and that was enough to make the maid freeze and the widow scream, outraged by such insolence from her daughter-in-law. She was about to strike Yu Shu again when her son stopped her, grabbing her arm sharply. A third person entered the room, bowing to properly greet the former empress. It was Dr. Jiang, who startled the widow with his sudden presence. That was enough to make the blonde woman panic, for she was about to be exposed. The physician approached, picking up the bundle to examine it. But before that, he asked for permission to take a look at the residue of the natural medicines that had been used by the other doctor. Nervous, one of the maids explained that she had thrown it away. But Yu Shu, more serious than ever, ordered her guards to take the woman away. However, before she could leave, a small bundle fell from the woman's clothes. Thus, the physician approached, examining the evidence with his keen sense of smell. Amid so much tension, he did not know whether he should truly speak the truth, as it could make things worse. So, after smelling the medicinal residue that had fallen from the concubine's garments, he explained that there was a question that would not leave his mind. He questioned the former physician about the presence of Nux vomica seeds, an abortifacient, in the mixture. The old doctor, terrified, denied knowing anything about it, but the empress immediately demanded to see the prescription. It was quickly examined by Zhang, who soon passed it to the emperor for him to take a look. However, he had no idea what was written on that piece of paper. Handing it back to the empress, who paid close attention to the new information. Shocked, she ordered the immediate arrest of all of Beauty Lee's servants for interrogation. Her mother-in-law, on the other hand, was still confused and asked what was happening. Before anyone could speak, Beauty Lee grabbed the emperor, saying that she had fallen into a trap. The imperial physician then revealed that, although he could not say whether it was a setup or not, the fact was that the fetus had already been dead for several days, and that revelation was enough to shock the dowager. Thus, Yu Shu encouraged her husband to give the orders. And so he did, breaking free from Beauty Lee and ordering the servants to close the palace gates and take the guilty physician away for trial, while Beauty Lee screamed, repeating that he could not do this to her. With that misunderstanding cleared up, the dowager apologized to her daughter-in-law, assuring her that she would thoroughly investigate that injustice. When the couple were finally alone, the emperor tried to comfort his wife, saying that he would bring justice in her name. But he ended up getting a smack from her as she refused to let him touch her under any circumstances. Even so, deep down, Yu Shu was glad that he showed he cared about her feelings. Then she stepped closer, stroking Xiao Jinyun's hair and apologizing for the past for the first time. Something simple, but it left the young man speechless. The next day, the truth came to light while the emperor was in his chambers. Apparently, an official admitted to having received a bribe from Beauty Lie. Knowing this, the young man ordered that his mother be informed immediately. At that moment, the woman was in her chambers, accompanied by the empress. And needless to say, the dowager was furious upon learning that the fetus had died earlier, and that the concubine had used this to frame the empress. While she shouted at the maids for having covered up for Beauty Lee, the poor women cried for mercy. However, Yu Shu confessed that she did not understand why the girl would frame her for something so criminal. So the woman encouraged her to go and ask personally. Curious, the girl went ahead, heading to the palace where the liar was staying to demand answers. She asked who was behind that plan, and what exactly Beauty Lee hoped to gain by lying that way. The girl replied with a psychopathic laugh, confessing that she did not need anyone to order her to do such a thing. And if the empress truly believed that, she had no idea of the suffering she went through. Still not understanding, Yu Shu explained that even if she never became an empress, she could obtain His Majesty's love without using lies or schemes. Hearing this, Beauty Lee stood up, laughing nonstop as she claimed that Xiao Jinyun only cared about the love he received from the queen. She explained that she only wanted to secure a slightly better life so she could raise her child, which was why she humiliated herself so much to get close to the emperor. Bitter, the woman made it clear that if she had the Empress's privileged position, she would never need to humiliate herself to obtain that man's love. Yushu stepped back. She could not understand it. Did the girl want Xiao Jinyun's love only to have a decent life? Apparently, the man continued to be successful even after the body swap. In a final desperate gesture, Beauty Lee tried to lunge at the girl, but luckily she dodged in time. Sometime later, the woman appeared in her husband's chambers. He comforted her, making it clear that other children would eventually come, so she did not need to worry about being without children. But he was scolded by Yushu, who stated that a real man should never worry about dying alone, something that surprised him. It did not take long for the news to spread, and he received a visit from Xiao Jinming, who hugged him the second he saw his brother. He tried to comfort the emperor in an awkward way, repeating Yushu's words about how a real man would never care about dying without a child, but he was quickly corrected, because, in truth, a man should not worry about dying alone. While the two of them kept bickering, the Empress concluded that they looked more like brothers now than when the couple had not yet swapped bodies. Later, Xiao Jinming was walking through the palace when something caught his attention. He quickly peeked from behind a door, finding the counselor performing his magic and studies. The man was confused because, for some reason, his calculations showed that the nation would be even more prosperous if the emperor remained in the Empress's body and vice versa, which made him think that he must have made some mistake. His reflection was interrupted when the prince arrived behind him, observing her. Annoyed and realizing that he would not simply leave, the mage decided to draw his attention, stating that if he stayed there, he would end up negatively influencing the calculations. That was enough to make the young man step away and go cry in a corner. However, the man then realized that perhaps having a member of the royal family nearby would make his calculations even more accurate. That was when he had a brilliant idea. Calling the attention of the hopeless young man and extending his hand before asking whether he would like to take a look at something very interesting that the girl had found. The fact that someone so important wanted to share anything with him was enough to make Xiao Jinming's eyes light up. However, when he tried to jump on the counselor like a puppy, the latter stopped him, grabbing his hand and quickly pricking his finger with a needle. The happiness that had been stamped on Xiao Jinming's face vanished completely, and tears filled his eyes, before the poor man began to scream, whining in pain like a baby. Meanwhile, the emperor was watching his wife very closely. That was because she seemed to be in a great mood that day. So maybe it was a good time to inform her that someone was trying to frame the Shu family. So, gathering his courage, he told her that he needed to tell her something. He began by commenting on the last time he went to the brothel, only to be interrupted when the woman said that he should never go back there again. As the two started arguing over this, the poor man did not even manage to share what he needed to say, because they were interrupted by Xiao Jinming, who burst in, throwing himself into his brother's arms to report that he had been harassed by the imperial counselor. Seeing that chaos, the Empress even felt embarrassed to have a brother like that, while Xiao Jinyun tried to understand what had happened. Then, completely distorting the situation, the prince explained that the counselor had captured him to get his blood and now he was dying in pain. Just imagining the scene of the young man with the counselor already disturbed Xiao Jinyun. A pity he did not know that the reality was quite different. The comical scene of the emperor consoling his brother was interrupted by the news that the general of the flying cavalry, brother of the true empress, had been wounded in battle and would soon return to the capital. That shook Yushu, still in her husband's body, making her immediately drop Xiao Jinming to the ground. Without thinking, he shouted, asking whether they were really talking about his brother. He remembered his childhood, when his brother took care of the girl with all the care in the world and carried her on his shoulders during their walks. Now, he trembled, not knowing how the young man was. Quickly, the Empress asked Xiao Jinming for leave, explaining that she needed to speak alone with her brother. Even though displeased, the prince withdrew. When they were alone, Xiao Jinyun angrily asked what exactly had happened, to which his wife calmly replied that the report of the previous battle had already mentioned what had happened and that he himself had already approved the general's return to the capital, making it clear that he only did not know anything because he had not personally checked the document. Xiao Jinyun immediately took the memorial from her hands and, upon reading its contents, began to tremble. He knew that being wounded in battle was something normal, but if the situation was serious enough for his brother to return to the capital for treatment, the injury had to be extremely severe. Then he realized a very important detail. Now, Yushu was trapped in the emperor's body, so she would not be able to visit him even if she wanted to. In addition, he feared that his wife might misunderstand his intentions and think that he was taking advantage of the opportunity to elevate his family's status, which would not be good. But suddenly, he had a great idea, asking whether the woman could visit his brother in his place, but he received a question in return. Why would he himself not go? Xiao Jinyun acted offended, arguing that he had no way of going with that appearance, which made his wife sigh, concluding that she had married someone very foolish. However, she soon held his hand affectionately, agreeing to go in his place. And so it was done. As soon as the general of the flying cavalry returned to the capital, the empress went to visit him at his home. Upon seeing the man wounded and lying in bed, Yushu softly called him older brother, playing her role. Noticing the empress's arrival, Junshu tried to get up to greet her, trying to ignore his injuries, at least until his wound began to bleed. Realizing this, the girl moved closer, insisting that there was no need for formalities. Right after saying that, the empress realized she did not know exactly how the real Yushu usually treated her family members. Junshu looked at her seriously, observing the court ladies who remained in the room, before asking the woman to dismiss them, which the empress did without questioning it. Next, she sat on the edge of the bed, asking why her brother was so badly injured, since the report from the battlefield did not explain the reason. But Junshu merely patted Yushu's head, saying that his little sister was a silly girl, and assuring her that everything was fine after all. He was still strong. Uncomfortable with that gesture, Yushu changed the subject, awkwardly asking how their father was doing, to which Junshu replied that the old man was still fighting against the Tartars, and he took the opportunity to ask how his little sister was living in the palace, and whether anything was bothering her. However, Yushu only remained silent. That made Junshu conclude that the girl was unhappy. He then took something from under his blanket to hand to her in an attempt to cheer the empress up. It was a stuffed teddy bear he had found in the middle of the desert. Holding the gift carefully, Yushu reflected in silence. In her memory, the man sitting in front of her was nothing more than a fierce general who dominated the battlefield with coldness. But apparently, he also had a very caring side. The one who broke the silence was Junshu, commenting that Earl Yunyang had been acting suspiciously in recent times, and that he did not know what the man might be planning, fearing it could be something against the emperor. And because of that, he insisted that his sister try to protect her husband at all costs, something that surprised Yushu. However, that serious atmosphere vanished when her second brother entered the room, slapping the poor girl on the back, something she was clearly not expecting. She turned with a cold look toward the man, who still had the same goofy demeanor as always. But the woman did not even manage to say anything, as she was forcibly pulled by the man, who said it was time for them to train some martial arts. The only problem was that despite being in his wife's body, Xiao Jinyun knew nothing about martial arts. Thus, they headed to the training grounds in the garden. The girl's brother was determined to take it seriously, while poor Yushu could not even think about what to do first. So when she saw him swing his fist toward her without hesitation, the empress could only scream in fear, trying to defend herself by putting her hands over her face, as if that would really help. Luckily for her, the man stopped the blow before hitting her, and confused, asked what was wrong with his sister, who was still trembling in terror. Then she tried to make up an excuse, explaining that she was a little sick and therefore could not do many extreme activities like fighting. Extremely worried, her brother shook her like a madman while asking what had happened to the girl. Still somewhat disoriented and trying to stop the shaking, Yushu blurted out that she might be pregnant, although she was not sure yet, and asked the man to be careful not to end up causing her to miscarry right there. Hearing that, the man could not believe what he was hearing, pacing back and forth to examine his sister. But soon after, he began jumping and shouting to the four winds that he was going to be an uncle. Poor Yushu could not stop him in time to prevent the man from running inside and shouting to Junshu that their little sister was pregnant, news that left him too shocked to say anything. Realizing the mess that had formed in the room, Yushu tried to smooth things over, explaining that she was not even sure yet, and, because of that, wanted them to keep quiet about the matter. But it was too late, and her brother, who was overjoyed, grabbed Yushu by the shoulders and said that he did not care whether the baby was a boy or a girl, because he would teach martial arts to him or her, so they would become the best fighter in the world. To which the girl retorted, saying that if it were a boy, he would become a prince one day, so he would not have any time at all to learn how to fight. But the man shot back that if that happened, then that was exactly why he would have to learn martial arts. After all, her husband was constantly being manipulated by old generals simply because he knew nothing about the art of war. His comment made the woman uncomfortable, but she could not say anything under those circumstances. And of course, they did not stop there, because Junshu told his brother to stop daydreaming, since Yushu would never be able to go against her husband's orders. It was sad for Xiao Jinyun to realize that even the empress's family already knew that the emperor did not love her, or at least, that was what they thought. The warrior continued, grumbling that even though they spent the entire year away, they were not blind enough to fail to notice reality. Now that they were in a position of power, their family had become the target of gossip. Gossip that must have even reached the emperor's ears. He interrupted his own reasoning, saying that they did not need a crown heir. They only wanted to ensure their sister's safety. That left Yushu speechless. She was almost offended to discover how little they thought of the emperor. When it was time to say goodbye, Yushu's more cheerful brother waved happily at the carriage. However, inside it, the girl reflected deeply on the entire day. She remembered the genuine joy of her brother-in-law at becoming an uncle and the kindness of the general, who asked that the girl raise the child like a normal prince, as his family would protect him. After all, the eldest could still fight for many years. At that moment, her mind was entirely focused on the Shu family. Meanwhile, in the palace, Xiao Jinyun trained in martial arts nonstop, delivering punches so powerful to the sandbag that his hands ended up injured. After taking a sip of water to regain his strength, he sighed in satisfaction. He was murmuring about how His Majesty's body was far too weak and needed much more training when the Empress arrived. From the doorway, Yushu asked who exactly he was calling weak, making Xiao Jinyun, startled, spit out all the water he was drinking. Nervous, the man asked when she had returned, but he soon ran toward her because he remembered something more important. And, shaking the poor woman nonstop, he asked how her older brother was doing. It was funny to see how similar he was to the brothers. Pushing his hands away, Yushu calmly replied that for now there was no reason to worry, and asked him to summon the royal physician for him, as well as to deliver the best medicine he had to him. When Xiao Jinyun questioned whether that was really appropriate, all Yushu said was that General Pyaoki bravely protected the border and deserved every effort from the empire. Surprised by such care, the emperor asked himself what on earth his brother had done to make his wife act so generously. Then he asked whether her second brother had committed any disrespect, explaining that he liked to joke around. The mention of Zhenshu made the woman burn with anger, ironically saying that it had not been very heavy. She had only almost turned to dust, and Xiao Jinyun tried to explain that it certainly had not been intentional, but the woman cut him off, saying that she was not blind and had figured everything out, including the fact that she had said she was pregnant just to escape martial arts training, and asked that if he ever met them, he should not contradict the story. Xiao Jinyun widened his eyes and shouted, indignant, wanting to know how she could say such an absurd thing. But Yushu was clever enough to change the subject when she saw the bow and arrows on the man's table. She warned him about the autumn hunt that would take place in a few days, and asked him to pay attention to Yun Boyang. However, the emperor only heard autumn hunt, as that alone was enough to make his eyes shine at the thought of riding and shooting freely without worrying about his appearance. Thus, he ran outside announcing that he was going to practice riding his horses. Standing there alone, Yushu murmured that her brother was counting on the emperor to protect her. But now that things were different, it was her turn to protect the man. Sometime later, the man sighed alone, looking out the window, anxious for the festival, when a man approached, calling his attention. It was Yun Yangbo, who wanted to deliver the security plan for the autumn hunt for him to take a look at. The man analyzed the document carefully, marking a few points where he believed more soldiers would be needed, as the current number would not be sufficient. That surprised the man somewhat, who did not even have time to say anything as the emperor grumbled that he was responsible for security, so he had to do his best to prevent any incident. With a malicious smile, he accepted the order superficially, changing the subject to ask which consorts would be invited to the event. But Xiao Jinyun dismissed the idea, as those councils were made up of fragile women, so he only intended to bring the queen. The gossip, however, suggested that General Pyaoki should accompany the emperor to such an important event while he was back in the city. But our man replied coldly, saying that since Junshu was injured, there was no point in taking him along, and he dismissed the servant. Outside the capital, on the western mountain, everything was already prepared for the festival. The imperial couple was atop the platform in the hunting grounds, when the girl spotted Jen in the middle of the crowd. Smiling as always, one of the officials handed the bow to the emperor so he could shoot the deer. Noticing the man's confusion, his wife explained that this was part of the opening of the ceremony. The animal was tied in the middle of the courtyard, and the fact that it was immobilized made Xiao Jinyun think that it was a complete sham. Because of that, he ordered them to release it. This left the people shocked. They knew that the emperor's skill was not the greatest, even with his servant trying to advise him against it, and with all the gossip around, he stood firm. Thus, they released the defenseless animal, which ran without stopping. But Xiao Jinyun did not retreat. He simply mounted his horse with all his courage, and coldly aimed at his target, pulling the bowstring with enviable precision, and striking the animal's chest without delay. That seemed to leave the emperor himself proud, as he smiled in relief. The crowd was left open-mouthed. They would never have imagined that this could actually happen. After the deer hunt ended, the officials gathered to praise the emperor, saying that he had put on quite a show. Hearing this, Yushu was left speechless. But inside, she only thought that her spouse was a silly woman. Xiao Jinyun, on the other hand, was more excited than ever, and soon pulled his wife's hand so the two could go horseback riding. But the woman argued that now that she was in a woman's body, she could not simply go riding and hunting around. But the emperor retorted, asking what the problem was since he was also a woman. Impatient, Yushu looked at her husband seriously, but did not waste her energy arguing with that clueless man. Suddenly, Xiao Jinming interrupted the two, calling his brother to hunt some rabbits, all excited. The man was a bit bothered, after all. What he really wanted to do was ride with his wife. But since she backed out, Xiao Jinyun ended up agreeing to go with his brother. Watching the two leave, Yushu thought they looked like two silly children. Thus, the woman decided to return to the camp. But something caught her attention. For some reason, her tent was separate from Xiao Jinyun's, something she questioned the imperial eunuch about. He explained that Yunyangbo had arranged the tents, justifying that since no other wives of the emperor had come this year, there were extra tents. The moment she heard that man's name, Yushu frowned, sensing that something was wrong. When night finally came, everyone gathered again and the officials went back to flattering the emperor, saying that he was incredible for having caught so many animals. That was enough to make the empress bite her tongue in anger. She thought that Xiao Jinyun was showing off too much, and because of that, she knew it would be difficult to take his place when everything returned to normal. When the man returned, the woman made a point of scolding him, saying that he was going too far and that people would end up discovering everything like this, so he needed to know when to stop. But of course, Xiao Jinyun just pretended not to understand the reason for all that arguing. The only thing the empress managed to notice was the rabbit coming out of her spouse's clothes. There could not have been a worse moment for that. Because of that, pulling the poor animal by the ears, she asked why that prey was not with the others. To which the man replied that it was not prey, but that he was going to take the little rabbit to the palace as a pet, because it was very cute. With no patience at all, Yushu argued that it was not appropriate for a ruler to go around with a rabbit, taking it from him. In the end, the woman stormed off from there, taking the animal with her while her husband whined. Late at night, while the empress slept with the new pet, someone opened the curtain of her tent. The gesture was enough to wake her with a jolt. Noticing that the entrance was open, she did not know what had happened or even where her guards were. When she decided to get up to check, a shadow appeared behind the girl. Then it revealed itself to be a man, holding a blade and ready to attack Yushu coldly. The man even tried to stab her, but Xiao Jinyun was faster. He dodged the blow quickly, sending the man flying in front of him, and he even managed to strike the assassin, knocking his knife away. Of course, that left the man furious. Xiao Jinyun, on the other hand, was more concerned with finding out who the man in front of him was, but he received no answer, as the man simply pulled another knife from his clothes and charged at him again, consumed by rage. Without thinking twice, the emperor landed a punch right in the middle of the bandit's face and even mocked him, saying that he was very bad at being an assassin. The man was terrified, wondering how an emperor like that had suddenly become so good at fighting out of nowhere. Then, realizing that he did not stand a chance, he simply ran out of the tent. Desperate, he immediately thought of the empress, who must have been sleeping in the tent next door. And indeed, the woman was in a deep sleep, accompanied by her little rabbit. Her husband ran to the other tent only to find the assassin with a knife at Yushu's neck, threatening to kill the empress if anyone came closer. That threat left the man frozen in fear, for he knew very well that the emperor occupying her body knew nothing about fighting. But Yushu was clever. When she saw the rabbit on top of the table, an idea sprang into her mind. So she kicked the piece of furniture, sending the animal flying into the assassin's face, which made the man release her immediately. Thus, taking advantage of the opening, she called her husband so he could take on the criminal. And so he did, quickly restraining the bandit. The guards finally appeared, asking if everything was all right, still outside the tent. But instead of asking for help, the woman told her husband to knock the assassin out immediately so he would not say anything. By then, the bandit was already foaming at the mouth and completely out of his mind, just like the poor rabbit. Even though he obeyed, the emperor could not help but question why they did not just call the guards right away. But Yushu explained that the situation was far too serious, since that was not just any assassin. So they needed to investigate on their own first, asking him to call his brother to help. So the emperor shouted for his men to leave, saying that the queen was in shock and not in any condition to speak with them at the moment. And so they did, leaving inside the tent only Zhenshu, who examined the assassin, still unconscious, very closely. It did not take long for him to notice something very interesting and call the couple over to take a look. The two approached, observing the bandit carefully. Then Zhenshu pointed to a wolf head tattoo on the man's body. They immediately suspected that the criminal had been sent by a rival group from the north. But Yushu denied that possibility, explaining that the place was very well protected, so there could only be a traitor inside helping the assassin. Zhenyu was left slack-jawed by his sister's sudden intelligence, and the Empress rolled her eyes, almost giving herself away by forgetting that she could not reveal anything about the body swap. Meanwhile, her husband was dying with laughter, even though he tried to hide it. Trying to resolve the situation quickly, she ordered that the man be taken away quietly and handed over to the commander of the palace guards, Zhao Hai, who was staying in the first tent to the west. Before finishing, the woman made it clear that this was the emperor's idea, knowing that only then would they obey. Cheerful, Zhenshu slapped his sister on the back, saying that he would do it immediately, taking the assassin, all tied up, to the other tent right afterward. Taking advantage of the fact that they were alone, the Empress called her husband, whispering something in his ear and making sure that he had understood everything properly. But Xiao Jinyun replied with the most clueless expression that he had not. Even so, smiling, he made it clear that although he did not understand any of those matters, he trusted the Empress completely and would do whatever she told him to do, which, honestly, was enough for the woman. The two stood there, staring deeply at each other, surrendered to that moment, when suddenly Zhenshu stuck his head in and announced that Zhao already knew exactly what to do. Startled, the couple separated, blushing like two teenagers. To disguise the awkward atmosphere, Yushu shoved the rabbit into her husband's arms and cleared her throat to try to change the subject. Meanwhile, Zhenshu remained standing there, confused and not understanding anything that was happening. Sometime later, Yun Yangbo was summoned by the king, kneeling on the ground as he listened to Xiao Jinyun's questioning about how he had organized the guard, since the assassin had managed to invade the Empress's quarters so easily. While he was there, humiliated and grinding his teeth in rage, the Duke thought to himself, very confused, whether the Emperor had gone to sleep in the Empress's quarters, ruining the assassin's plan, since he believed the two did not get along. Xiao Jinyun then gave a harsh order to Yun Yangbo, demanding that he investigate and capture the assassin before dawn. Because of that incident, the soldiers spent the entire night searching all the tents there. A subordinate approached the Duke, whispering what they should do, since if they did not catch the assassin, Yun Yangbo would be questioned again. Furious, the Duke punched a nearby tree and began cursing internally, remembering that the agreement was that if the plan failed, the assassin should stay there and simply wait to be caught. With no other option, he angrily ordered the subordinate to fetch his backup plan and bring it to him. Early the next morning, the Emperor looked at Yun Yangbo in surprise as he brought an unknown man with great pride, claiming to the Emperor that they had finally captured the assassin. Xiao Jinyun stared at the Duke with great suspicion, because he knew that the real assassin had already been taken away by his brother. At that moment, the image of Zhenshu torturing and whipping the man from the previous night even crossed his mind, which made him wonder who the person standing in front of him now actually was. He barely had time to say anything before the Duke kicked the man to the ground and tore open his shirt, revealing a wolf head tattoo on his chest. He continued his act, telling the Emperor that this person was an intruder from the northern border and that his plan seemed to be even bigger. Xiao Jinyun froze for a moment, completely forgetting what he was going to say, and he looked to the side seeking help but realized that the place where his wife should have been sitting was empty. While he wondered where she had gone, Yun Yangbo continued pretending to be furious and ordered the man to say who had sent him there. The man only managed to utter the beginning of a word, "Shu," before biting his own tongue to silence himself. That was too much for the Emperor, who shouted, ordering the man to speak up, while the Duke smiled in satisfaction as his plan B was working. However, before he could say the rest, the supposed assassin fell dead to the ground. Yun Yangbo did not even care about that and took the opportunity to comment that, since the matter involved the safety of the royal family, he begged forgiveness for offering his opinion, but stated that currently the only person who had contacts on the northern border was General Marshal Shu. That information made the Emperor so furious that he had to grip the edge of his robe tightly to avoid losing control right there. It was at that moment that Yu Shu entered the tent and calmly replied to the Duke's words, asking whether he was suggesting that the assassin had been sent by her family. Yun Yangbo turned his head in shock when he realized that behind the Empress came Zhenshu, carrying the real captured assassin in his arms. Even amid so much tension, something caught the young man's attention. His wife had spoken as if the family belonged to both of them. That moved him so deeply that he had to cover his mouth with his hand to avoid showing any reaction in front of those people. Thus, All the anger he had once felt disappeared from his heart. Then, resting his chin on his hand with joy, Xiao Jinyun simply watched his wife argue with the lying duke. The man was so happy at that moment that he did not even pay attention to the insults and the politics involved in the situation, letting everything go in one ear and out the other. Meanwhile, Genju wondered when his little sister had become so determined and brave. But when he glanced to the side, he had an idea. He noticed that the emperor looked at his sister with immense love and adoration. Then he concluded that this was why Yushu had changed so much. He knew he had to tell all of this to his brother as soon as he got home. But that moment was interrupted when Yun Yangbo began shouting furiously, saying that the empress was making up lies about him. Hearing someone calling him, the man finally snapped out of his reverie, receiving a signal from his wife to resume his posture. Quickly, he pointed to the person standing beside the duke and ordered him to say at once where they had found that supposed assassin, to which the subordinate replied that everything had been staged beforehand by the duke himself. Enraged, Yun Yangbo began cursing the man, asking how he dared betray him like that, and then looked at the emperor, turning pale and trembling with fear upon realizing that the emperor had already placed an infiltrator there. Without wasting time, Xiao Jinyun ordered the duke to be bound and taken away. As soon as Yun Yangbo and the fake assassin were taken away by Zhenshu, the couple was finally left alone in the tent. And romantic as always, the man slowly approached Yushu and asked excitedly how she knew that the duke was the problem and how she had arranged everything. But the girl merely crossed her arms, lifted her chin proudly, and replied with a laugh that there was nothing she was incapable of finding out. That made the emperor laugh, explaining that it was funny to look at herself that way, which made the girl blush, igniting her love even more. While Xiao Jinyun could not stop laughing, his wife, who was already out of patience, suggested that the empress's older brother should be put in charge of the interrogation. However, the man immediately rejected the idea, explaining that from the very beginning, her brother and Yun Yangbo had never gotten along. So if he conducted the interrogation, it would be very difficult to convince the people of the process's impartiality. That made Yushu thoughtful about the matter. But she was soon interrupted by the arrival of Xiao Jinming, who was extremely excited, calling his brother to go fishing together. Seeing the boy, Yushu had a very good idea and quickly proposed that the prince be put in charge of interrogating the suspects. Poor Xiao Jinming was completely lost, not understanding what they were talking about. Noticing the boy's reaction, Xiao Jinyun asked whether his wife was sure that was a good idea. After all, his brother's usual behavior had already ruined his image as a tough person. Even so, she confidently approached Xiao Jinming, gently placing a hand on his shoulder before assuring him that he would not disappoint anyone. Confused, the prince called out to the emperor to ask what was going on. So the man explained the whole situation to him, leaving him completely stunned. Now, the boy tried to keep a confident tone as he said that the case of Duke Yun Yangbo was entirely in his hands. For Xiao Jinming, that felt like a bucket of cold water. He clung to his brother's legs, crying and begging him not to do this, saying that he only wanted to live like a normal prince and did not want to work. But it was already decided. He grabbed the boy by the ear, making it clear that if he did not accept, he would have to spend the next month in the star-picking palace helping the imperial preceptor with his prayers. Because of the assassination attempt, the hunting trip ended early, and everyone returned to the imperial palace. When they arrived, Xiao Jinming still tried to complain to the Dowager Empress, saying that his brother had forced him to investigate the case. But she only comforted him, saying that this was a sign that the emperor valued him and that he would do well on this mission. Seeing that he would not get anything there, he even tried to whine to Luo Hanying, who calmly replied that if he did not want to go, he did not have to, and that she herself would speak to the emperor, saying that she needed help in her palace. But just thinking about working with that lunatic, who was always trying to poke him with needles, already made him want to cry. Because of that, Xiao Jinming only forced a weak smile and said that it was better for him to handle the bandit's case for his brother. Thus, the man went to the Supreme Court, sitting at the main table while the officials waited for him. He was extremely thoughtful until a servant reported that the assassin spoke the Hun language, a minority ethnicity located in northern China, and that the word shu was the only Chinese word they knew, so they had not been able to extract much information from the assassin. Hearing that, the man grew pensive, fan in hand, before suggesting to Zhenshu that, to avoid any suspicion, he should temporarily step away and let him handle everything else himself, something the man obeyed without thinking twice, until someone called the boy's attention. The tribunal's deputy suggested that they bring the duke in to testify. However, Xiao Jinming calmly replied that he was in no hurry and first wanted to stop by the duke's mansion. Upon arriving there, the palace was surrounded by soldiers, and the boy waited calmly while the servants bowed to him formally. He gave orders for a very precise search in every corner of the place. The Duke's wife even tried to be pleasant, asking with a smile what they were looking for and whether she could help in any way. However, politely, Xiao Jinming declined, asking her only to rest in the meantime, which left the woman delighted, along with her maid. That delight did not last long, however, as the Duke's wife's concern was even greater. She knew that if it were an ordinary official, she could manipulate him. But since it was the emperor's brother, a very stubborn young man, things would be quite different. Suddenly, a soldier handed 2 envelopes to the man. They were letters he had found in the palace. Letters that Xiao Jinming read carefully. One of them bore the signature of the Marquis of the North, and it did not take long for them to form a very precise line of reasoning. The assassin was a foreigner, and that particular Marquis had fought in the Northwest, which made it easier for him to encounter other foreigners. In addition, theoretically, he was related to the Duke through marriage. The servant was already about to draw his obvious conclusions, but he was interrupted by Xiao Jinming, who secretly asked that the 2 of them make a small visit to the palace before anything else, leaving him a little confused. To his surprise, the investigation led them straight to a brothel. He had no idea of the real reason they were there. It did not take long for Xiao Jinming to start flirting with the women there instead of working alongside his partner. Unable to take it anymore, the servant shouted that time was passing and asked what he was doing. However, the prince merely told him to be quiet and, with his fan in a gallant manner, invited the singer to perform at a banquet in his mansion that night, something she accepted with great pleasure. Later, however, the girl found herself not at a banquet, but in the palace prison, surrounded by soldiers, and she turned pale with fear. She tried not to panic, saying that His Majesty's hobbies were quite different, but he replied that, in truth, there was nothing special. He just remembered the last time he had visited that place with her and remembered that she had said something to Lord Wang. The memories ran through his mind rapidly. He remembered the singer saying something about the eldest son of the Shu family. Even so, with complete shamelessness, the girl tried to deny it, saying she had no idea what he was talking about. However, the man was smarter, and pointing to the soldiers' weapons, he said it would be better for her not to pretend to be innocent, because if she did not tell the truth, she would regret it. After all, he was accompanied by men who knew how to deal with a liar. Terrified, she screamed, saying she would say everything he wanted. Meanwhile, the servant asked why interrogate a singer like her, to which he replied with another question, asking whether he knew who owned that brothel. But the servant had no idea. Thus, the prince grabbed his hand and quickly wrote, "It was the Marquis of the North," a surprise to the servant. Shortly after, Xiao Jinming took the case file to his brother, who read the notes somewhat confused. There was information about a perfume shop, the brothel the 2 frequented, and more. However, the main suspect should have been Yun Yangbo, but his brother explained that the assassin had indeed been hired by the Duke, who had confessed to trying to frame the family in order to get rid of political opponents. However, he was certain that there was more involved in all of this. Thinking it over, Xiao Jinyun questioned a few things. First, the Yun Yangbo family was not favored by the emperor, so why would an ordinary man try to frame them? Furthermore, even if all of that were true, no one would try to kill the emperor and risk their life like that. Then, jokingly, his brother commented that he was very lucky to have ended up sleeping in his wife's room that very night. After all, the worst could have happened if that had not occurred. Dying of embarrassment, Xiao Jinyun hurried to punch his brother, shouting that he was completely clueless, but he soon tried to control himself and asked him to continue. Even somewhat offended by his brother's aggression, Xiao Jinming simply agreed and took a small pouch from his pocket, explaining that a spice shop in the north sold Western fragrances used by foreign merchants. Realizing that his brother was still lost in his line of reasoning, he continued, revealing that that scent was exactly the same one found on the bodies of the 2 supposed assassins. Upon hearing Xiao Jinming's discoveries, Xiao Jinyun was visibly shocked, and he asked whether he was suggesting that the assassin had slipped into the capital hidden among the spice shop's caravan. Without waiting for the prince to answer, the emperor wanted to know who the true owner of the establishment was. That was when Xiao Jinming opened a sly smile and revealed that the shop was part of the dowry of the wife of the Marquis of the Northern Garrisons. It was clear that things were only becoming more and more complicated. First, there had been all the trouble with Yun Yangbo, and now even the Marquis was involved. Trying to clear his thoughts, he asked what that man would gain by getting involved in a scheme like that, to which Xiao Jinming replied that that was precisely the point. After all, if the assassination attempt failed, everything would already be prepared to frame the Shu family. After all, killing an emperor was not something simple, so the man must have thought through every detail. Hearing that, Xiao Jinyun shuddered. He gripped the arm of the throne tightly and, still incredulous, asked what would have happened if the plan had succeeded. At that moment, Yushu appeared from behind the curtain and completed the line of reasoning, stating that if the emperor died, since there were still no heirs, someone would be extremely benefited, as they would have the right to succeed to the throne. Indignant and full of anxiety, the boy asked who that person would be. But before the silence could drag on, Xiao Jinming opened his fan with absolute confidence and stated that that person would be none other than himself. Xiao Jinyun stared at him for a few seconds, completely silent. However, he could not hold it in and burst out laughing uncontrollably. Irritated, Xiao Jinming asked what was so funny, accusing his brother of always doubting his abilities. Without beating around the bush, Xiao Jinyun made it very clear that he did not believe in that far-fetched idea even a little. Because of that, Xiao Jinming eventually gave in and admitted that he truly did not have the necessary profile to plan a rebellion of that scale. With that in mind, he concluded that the only ones who could truly covet the throne would be the royal uncles. At that moment, Xiao Jinyun finally connected the dots and realized that, among all of them, only one possessed enough military power and ambition for something so bold: the third royal uncle. Suddenly, the conversation was interrupted by someone announcing that Beauty Lee had just tried to hang herself, leaving everyone stunned. Upon hearing that, Xiao Jinyun slammed his hand on the table, demanding to know where the girl was. However, the old eunuch quickly explained that she had been rescued in time and was out of danger, remaining under the watch of the maids. Still shaken, Xiao Jinyun asked how Beauty Lee had been punished after the last incident, to which his wife replied that the girl had lost her title and been expelled from the palace. As she said that, the empress realized that she needed to see her personally and decided to act without delay. Meanwhile, Xiao Jinming tried to approach just to gossip and ask who this so-called Beauty Lee really was. However, Xiao Jinyun immediately pushed him away, ordering him to get back to work. The emperor commanded him to investigate how the Marquis of the North and the third royal uncle were coordinating and whether there were any suspicious changes in the city. Annoyed, Xiao Jinming sat down sulking, saying that he was giving up on the investigation because he had only agreed to that madness to protect his brother, and stated that he did not want to talk about the case anymore. Realizing that the prince was about to back out, Xiao Jinyun had a great idea. Then, using all of his talent and shamelessness, he pretended to be talking to the counselor, explaining that Xiao Jinming was about to visit him to offer his help with whatever was needed. That alone was enough for the boy to change his attitude immediately, acting all hurried and saying that he was extremely busy with the investigation. The king did not even give him time to back out, as he ran out of the room with the confirmation that his brother would continue the mission. Meanwhile, upon arriving at Beauty Lee's quarters, Yushu asked what the real reason was for her attempting to take her own life. In response, the young woman merely recited a few enigmatic verses, speaking of mandarin ducks that lived in the lake of the imperial garden. The woman seemed to recognize those verses, but she was direct and warned her that the suicide of a concubine was considered a very serious crime. Such an act could completely ruin Beauty Lee's family, destroying her father's career and compromising her brother's futures. Then she asked whether someone was pressuring or threatening the young woman. Beauty Lee then opened a sad smile and commented that the empress knew the laws of the empire very well, suggesting that Yushu herself must endure a miserable life for the sake of her brothers and father. Upon hearing that, Yushu thought of the girl's family. At that moment, the emperor, still trapped in the empress's body, ended up lost in thought, wondering whether Xiao Jinyun's sacrifice throughout all those years had been for love of him, or merely out of obligation toward his relatives, leaving him completely shaken. Beauty Lee lowered her gaze to her own hands, injured because of her failed attempt, before venting to the woman, stating that no one wishes to die when life still seems good. Then, the girl asked His Majesty to come closer, as she wanted to speak with her alone, a request that surprised Yushu. Even so, she stepped closer to listen carefully to Beauty Lee. But in the next instant, the girl stared at her like a true psychopath and used her hairpin to try to stab her without any warning. By a narrow margin, Yushu managed to dodge the attack. Even so, Beauty Lee smiled crazily, gripping her hand tightly, and finally achieved what she wanted so badly. She plunged the hairpin into her own chest. That left the girl completely shaken. She had no idea what had just happened. But before closing her eyes for the last time, Beauty Lee leaned close to the Empress's ear to whisper that she knew suicide was considered a crime, and, in a tone heavy with guilt but also relief, apologized to the Empress. Yushu stared at her own blood-covered hand, unresponsive. At that exact moment, a maid ran in screaming, accusing the woman of having killed someone. Soon after, the lady-in-waiting True arrived at the scene with a victorious smile, alongside the Emperor, who was deeply disturbed by everything he was witnessing. However, he approached his wife, worried, trying to make sure that she was truly all right. It did not even take a minute for Yushu to realize what was happening. It had been a trap set by consort True, who was still staring at her as if she had won the Cold War the two of them had been fighting. Because of that, Yushu acted swiftly and coldly. Without hesitating, she stated that Beauty Lee had stolen the Phoenix hairpin in an attempt to assassinate her, and that, during the struggle between the two of them, she had ended up injuring herself accidentally. Faced with this sudden turn of events, consort True fell into silent panic, since the original plan had been to accuse the Empress of driving the young woman to suicide. Now she no longer knew what to do to turn the situation against the queen again. Xiao Jinyun also noticed that something was wrong, but he decided to play along without thinking twice. He confirmed that he had also witnessed the assassination attempt against his wife and pressed consort True, asking whether she had not seen exactly the same scene. With nowhere to escape, the villain was forced to lie, claiming that she had not been able to see anything clearly. Back in their chambers, Xiao Jinyun shut the door and collapsed under the weight of everything that had happened. Still stressed, he questioned why Yushu always ended up getting herself into trouble within the harem. However, instead of answering her husband, the Empress was more curious about the verses that Beauty Lee had recited earlier, and she made sure to write them down so as not to forget. Not understanding anything, Xiao Jinyun approached, asking what it was that his wife was reading, to which she replied that they were the verses Beauty Lee had recited before her death. Impatient, the man grabbed the paper and commented that no one would be in the mood to recite a poem on their deathbed, and that, to him, that poem made no sense at all and did not seem special in the slightest. That was when Yushu finally lost her patience, smacking her husband on the head with a brush, saying that she was certain the poetry did not end there. There were more verses missing. Then, she recited the rest of the poem. This time the line said, "There is a peach tree by the well, where a plum tree is still growing. When the worms gnaw at the root of the peach tree, the plum tree invites them to its feet. In the end, the plum tree died and ossified itself solely for the peach tree." Hearing this, Xiao Jinyun finally understood the riddle, leaving his wife satisfied. Excited, he gave Yushu an enthusiastic slap on the shoulder, praising her beautiful handwriting as the poor woman was sent flying. The impact was so strong that the woman ended up falling to the ground, cursing the emperor in her mind for being so stupid. Even so, she got up right after and explained the truth behind the poem. According to her, Beauty Lee had not truly wanted to die. In reality, she had been serving as a scapegoat for someone else. Pointing to the paper, Yushu explained that plum was pronounced Li in Chinese, while peach sounded like Tao, and asked whether there was anyone with the surname Tao in the palace. By coincidence or not, the only person with that surname was Jieu Tao, the consort who was always plotting against the couple. But then he took the chance to ask how his wife knew that Beauty Lee truly did not want to die. After all, she had been a low-ranking concubine in the empire, meaning she must have suffered all kinds of torment from the other women. To that, his wife replied that she had a living father and brothers, stating that it was a very similar situation to Yushu's own, who had only married Xiao Jinyun for the sake of her family. The man exploded at that accusation, making it clear that he did not care about the status or power he had gained when he was still in his original body. He was about to reveal that he had married the man only because he loved him when he was interrupted by a provocation from the Empress, which was enough to leave him embarrassed and make him fall silent immediately. While Yushu was full of energy, looking at him with confidence, Xiao Jinyun could not hide his own shyness. His face was red as a tomato, and without thinking twice, he shoved his wife away roughly, complaining that she was very annoying. The poor woman ended up falling to the ground and, playing along, began writing his name in the dirt. Only then did Xiao Jinyun finally give in and help her up, still feeling awkward. But he soon changed the subject when he remembered an important detail. He commented that the late Beauty Lee had once been a lady-in-waiting to Tao. In addition, he asked whether Yushu had already forgotten that the girl had only been promoted to the title of beauty because she herself had favored her in the past. Caught off guard, Yushu felt a bit awkward, completely guilty about it, but she tried to explain that there were so many concubines in the harem that it was practically impossible to remember all the family ties between them. However, her husband did not let it slide. He stepped closer, lifted the girl's chin in provocation, and then asked whether she really did not remember that Jieu Tao was the niece of the Marquise of the North. Upon hearing that name, Yushu reacted immediately, brushing the emperor's hand away from her face as she questioned what he was talking about. That was because, until then, She had believed that the chaos in the harem was merely the result of petty squabbles between women, but if the Marquis was involved, then Beauty Lee's suicide was certainly directly connected to him. Without wasting any time, the woman ordered one of her maids to bring all the harem records to her chamber immediately. With the records finally in hand, Yu Shu began her analysis. She tried to establish connections between Yun Yangbo, the Marquis of the North, Jieyu Tao, and Beauty Lee. Suddenly, Xiao Jinyun approached, took the brush from his wife's hand, and asked whether she truly suspected that the two cases were connected. To better explain his point of view, he began drawing on the paper. He drew a very strange-looking turtle on the page. According to his analogy, Yun Yangbo represented the head, the Marquis and Tao formed the shell, while Beauty Lee was the tail. In a joking tone, Xiao Jinyun commented that when a turtle sticks its head out, the tail has to be cut off. Yu Shu could not help but smile and admitted that, despite his words being somewhat crude, his reasoning made perfect sense. She even added that her husband was not actually that stupid, which he tried not to take as an insult after all. He was a mage above all else. However, when she looked at Beauty Lee's name written on the paper, Yu Shu's smile faded, as it reminded her of the girl lying on the ground in front of her. She felt a tightness in her chest as she commented that, given the circumstances, the loss of that woman's child was probably not an accident. As she flipped through the record book, she was still confused about the Marquis's involvement in all of it. That was when something caught her attention, making her eyes widen. Then, Yu Shu asked her husband whether he knew anything about an inspection that had been carried out at Jieyu Tao's palace by order of a high-ranking noble consort, something that Xiao Jinyun confirmed, adding that the incident had been a true scandal, even though it had led nowhere. He explained that, at the time, he had been extremely furious upon discovering that the consort had acted without his authorization. But when confronted, the woman had reacted with complete indifference, crossing her arms and claiming that it had been an urgent matter, so she had not had time to ask for permission. Moreover, she stated that since she was responsible for the Phoenix Seal, she was merely helping the Empress, all to prevent her reputation from being tarnished in any way. Yu Shu immediately realized that Lady Lee's death and that sudden inspection at the palace were directly connected. Because of that, she ordered one of her servants to summon Tao there in secret, but her foolish husband still did not understand the connection between those events, so he decided to ask Yu Shu. Noticing Xiao Jinyun's confused expression, she let out a deep sigh and smacked him on the head, teasingly asking how he had managed to survive for so long in the palace with such slow reasoning. But the man only smiled and replied with complete confidence that he had always relied on the Empress's love to help him. Without patience for that conversation, the woman simply told him to hide behind a screen in the room to observe everything closely, while she herself would conduct the interrogation. As soon as Jieyu Tao arrived, the Empress focused on keeping calm. The girl, on the other hand, was nervous because lately Yu Shu had been even closer to the Emperor, so she had to be careful not to offend her. Without further delay, the Queen picked up her tea and stated casually that Lady Lee had confessed everything before dying. This made Jieyu Tao break into a cold sweat. However, trying to escape the situation, she simply pretended to know nothing. Still, Yu Shu went straight to the point and asked what kind of blackmail the noble consort was using to make her risk her own life like that, and even destroy Lady Lee's child just to harm her. Even trembling with fear, the girl insisted that she had done nothing against the deceased, but our girl would not give up so easily. Therefore, she threatened to take the case directly to the Emperor and order an investigation at the Marquis of the North's mansion to clear up any misunderstanding. At that moment, Jieyu Tao fell into complete despair and ended up letting something slip about a talisman, explaining that it was only meant to ask for a child through magic. For a brief second, Yu Shu froze. What did she mean? A talisman? And the girl immediately regretted it, realizing that she had said more than she should have. The Empress stared at the woman in front of her without the slightest mercy. Soon after, she stood up, consumed by rage, gripping the consort's chin tightly as she shouted that performing witchcraft rituals inside the palace was an extremely serious crime, punishable by the execution of her entire family. Desperate for salvation, the girl made it clear that she had done none of that, and that the woman had misunderstood her words. But to Yu Shu, everything was clear. Jieyu Tao had used that talisman, had been caught by a high-status concubine, who then threatened her with it and forced her to somehow influence Beauty Lee's death. With a voice filled with contempt, the Empress declared that she would tell all of this to her husband, and she made a point of making it clear that from that moment on, the noble consort would not lift a single finger to protect her. A short while later, Xiao Jinming appeared bringing new information to his brother. He reported that the wife of the Marquis of the North had gone to burn incense at the temple and had requested permission to visit Jeyu Tao in the palace. According to her, the reason for the visit was to see a certain master she had recently met, but her maids did not know what the subject of that conversation was. In the middle of his report, Xiao Jinming noticed someone approaching and, overcome with fear, immediately hid behind Xiao Jinyun, who turned around to see who had caused all that commotion in his little brother. But it was only Luo Hanying, walking calmly while holding a compass. Xiao Jinming immediately found it strange that a man who was not part of the royal family was walking around the Phoenix Palace, but Xiao Jinyun retorted impatiently, asking whether he himself was not also a man. Then the emperor approached the counselor to ask about his progress on the matter they had discussed earlier. Without batting an eye, he explained that if his calculations were indeed correct, the answer to everything must lie in the lotus pond. To confirm it, a maid dove into the water and soon returned carrying a very strange cloth doll. Upon seeing the object, our boy could not help but notice how familiar it was and handed it to the counselor. He examined everything quickly, cutting the doll's clothes open with scissors and revealing several red writings on the back of the toy. Xiao Jinming was utterly shocked when he realized that those were the emperor's own birth details. Suddenly, Yushu approached, demanding to know what was going on there. Faced with the scene, Xiao Jinyun was completely terrified, unable to understand who could have thrown that there. Anyone in the empire knew that a doll with those details carved into it could only mean one thing: an attempt to curse the emperor, something that was a serious crime there. After examining the doll carefully, Luo Hanying concluded that it was occult magic. However, he was confused because it did not seem that the curse had actually succeeded. According to him, the original plan was to kill the emperor, but something had gone wrong, causing the spell to instead trigger a soul exchange between the emperor and the empress. The counselor sat down to explain the entire situation to the family members. Upon hearing this, Xiao Jinyun fell into despair. He thought that if that object were discovered inside his palace, he would never be able to explain himself. Noticing her husband's anguish, Yushu called out to him, saying that she truly had not been aware of the whole situation, but judging by the counselor's explanation, that doll must have come from Jeyu Tao's palace. After all, she worked for the high-status concubine, and in return, that woman would help her hide anything. At the time, the consort had the Phoenix Seal under her control and had men she could trust to do the dirty work, so she could easily have planted the doll in that pond. Xiao Jinming was indignant about all of it, arguing that while on one hand the noble consort had likely used Jeyu Tao to plant the doll in the pond, on the other hand, she knew that when the pond dried up, that object would clearly surface. And then, she could accuse the empress of using magic against her husband and send her to execution. After all, no one would believe her. The emperor, shocked, stared at his wife, before embracing her and assuring her that he believed her completely. Realizing that Xiao Jinyun trusted her fully, Yushu was moved and hugged him, saying that she also believed in him, while Xiao Jinming amused himself watching the atmosphere between the two. But Luo Hanying interrupted the lovebirds, asking the emperor to order a search for bottles of yang water. Before Xiao Jinyun could say anything, his brother cut in, asking what that water was. Then he explained that it was a liquid that had to be kept in dark containers, red like blood, and with a strong heather flower scent. When Xiao Jinyun asked what that smell was, Xiao Jinming stepped closer and whispered in her ear that it was the scent of male vital fluid. The result was immediate. His wife immediately ran over and slapped the boy, while the poor Xiao Jinyun turned completely red with embarrassment. Yushu gave Xiao Jinming a light pat on the shoulder and told him to mobilize the imperial guards immediately. The instruction was clear. As soon as he received the signal, the Marquis of the North was to be arrested without hesitation. Meanwhile, she herself would be responsible for commanding the servants to search the entire imperial harem. As soon as Xiao Jinming withdrew, Yushu turned to Luo Hanying and demanded that he speak up. She needed the counselor to explain, in detail, exactly what was going on. Hidden behind her, with a visibly worried expression, Xiao Jinyun listened carefully to every word the mage said. Luo Hanying then clarified that if they really found that so-called yang water, they would be dealing with a serious case of occult magic from the western regions. He explained that the spell worked as follows. A doll would be placed on the bed, and during the couple's moments of intimacy, the liquid would be sprinkled. With that, the emperor would fall into a coma until each of his organs failed and he slowly withered away and died. And when examined, it would appear that the death had been sudden during sexual activity. Upon hearing this explanation, Yushu was consumed by fury. Just thinking about that possibility was absurd. She ground her teeth as she realized that whoever had planned it did not just want to kill him, but wanted him to die in the most humiliating way possible. Trying to calm her down, Xiao Jinyun placed a hand on her shoulder and asked Luo Hanying how that entire plan had ended up resulting in the two of them switching bodies. Thus, the counselor explained that the talisman served to manipulate yin and yang energies, and when the enchantment came into contact with the yang water, it could drain all of the man's vital energy in a single second. However, it had been thrown into the lotus pond, and that combination of the water with the talisman and the magical liquid ended up creating an unexpected force field, which caused the souls of the two to be inverted at the moment they fell into the water together. Faced with this, Yu Shu clenched the doll even tighter, cursing the official traitor for such audacity. Trying to lighten the mood, Xiao Jinyun even joked that the harem was so dangerous that perhaps the emperor should convert and become a monk, since that way he would be safer. And although his wife did not find it funny at all, Luo Hanying burst out laughing. Finally, before leaving, Luo Hanying asked that as soon as they found the liquid, they should call him immediately. Without wasting time, Yu Shu ordered the guards to accompany her immediately to search the noble consort's quarters. Upon hearing this, Xiao Jinyun found it strange and asked whether the search should not be conducted in Jie Tao's palace. However, the woman explained that that concubine would never have the courage to kill her, since she would end up dying as well. Moreover, she truly believed that the girl thought the talisman was nothing more than a simple fertility amulet. Given this explanation, the emperor quickly concluded that the flask found could only belong to the noble consort. Hearing this, Yu Shu commented that, at least on that point, Xiao Jinyun was not so stupid. In his thoughts, he reflected that, in that true nest of vipers that was the harem, only Yu Shu managed to keep her heart pure and be truthful with him. Next, she asked him to go to the Empress Dowager to inform her about the assassination plot against her. However, she made a point of emphasizing that he should not mention that the doll had been found in the Phoenix Palace, but rather in the Imperial Garden. Visibly worried, Xiao Jinyun asked his wife to be careful as well, since they did not know what other plans might have been devised. The boy was about to go meet his mother when his wife stopped him, gripping his hand tightly, calling his attention. Then she said that, if it were possible to see people's true hearts, all those tricks would be useless, and finally confessed that she had been foolish in the past, nearly losing her own life and throwing away what she held most precious. Curious, Xiao Jinyun asked what that treasure was. In response, Yu Shu simply smiled lovingly and said she would leave that in the air for him to discover on his own. Thus, our girl followed the soldiers to the noble consort's palace, her face carrying a completely icy expression. As soon as the guards began to search the place, the villainess turned pale with fear. And that tension only grew until one of the maids found a black jar hidden among the concubine's belongings. Faced with this, Yu Shu clenched her fists and, in a cold voice, ordered the consort to accompany her immediately to the Palace of Peace. Even so, the woman still tried to play dumb, pretending not to know what that suspicious object was about. Meanwhile, at the palace, Xiao Jinyun was reporting everything to the Empress Dowager, exactly as they had agreed. She explained that the spell was meant to cause the emperor's immediate death, and that if the yang water were used on him, he would collapse instantly, with symptoms similar to those of a sudden death in the middle of sexual activity. Upon seeing the voodoo doll, the Empress Dowager began to tremble with rage, unable to believe that someone wanted to harm her precious son. Without hesitation, the lady ordered that the object be placed in a box and taken immediately to the imperial counselor, making it clear that any failure by the servants along the way would be punished with death. It was at that moment that Yu Shu arrived, bringing with her the noble consort and Jie Tao. Upon realizing the woman's presence there, the girl trembled to her core. Feeling humiliated at being treated like a criminal, the consort even tried to play the victim in front of her aunt, the Empress Dowager, complaining about the unexpected search of her quarters and begging for justice. However, Yu Shu remained calm and reported that she had found a jar identical to the one described by the counselor as part of occult magic in the girl's palace. That was enough to make the woman scream and question how her niece had dared to do something like that, and she asked where she had gotten it. The girl tried to think of something that could get her out of that situation until she noticed the doll there, which gave her a great idea. Then she made up a story, saying that she had received the jar from Jie Tao and that her friend had said it was nothing more than sacred water for fertility. And because of that, she believed her friend and kept the liquid with her. What a shameless woman. Without hesitation, Jie Tao confessed that her aunt really had brought the liquid from a temple and handed it to her, and that she had decided to gift it to the noble consort. Letting out a dry laugh, the Empress interrupted the two liars, saying that the liquid had indeed come from the mansion of the Marquise of the North. Faced with this, she suggested that she herself and the Empress Dowager would take care of the matter, while the Emperor should focus on attending court, since Xiao Jinming was still waiting for him. Yu Shu understood the message immediately and, without insisting, took her leave of the Empress Dowager to attend to her responsibilities. The woman was already at her limit, so she simply told him to go quickly before his brother lost patience. Meanwhile, a group of soldiers, led by Xiao Jinming, surrounded the mansion. When the residents began to ask what was happening, Xiao Jinming merely cleaned his ear with utter disdain, not bothering to answer. Soon after, a soldier arrived explaining that, by order of the Emperor, the mansion was to be surrounded immediately and the Marquis arrested. Without wasting time, Xiao Jinming ordered the soldiers to act at once. Sometime later, Xiao Jinming reappeared before his brother, hopping with joy and holding a notebook full of confessions. Fanning himself confidently, he assured that he had not failed the mission, because he had discovered extremely important clues, while his brother simply prepared himself to hear everything he had to say. Xiao Jinming began reenacting the entire story in an exaggerated manner, pretending to be a traveling Taoist monk. He said that Zhenbei's wife had encountered a so-called master at a temple outside the city, and that it was he who gave her a fertility spell. Soon after, the boy completely changed roles and began pretending to be Dao Thiepdu. According to him, the concubine had merely followed her aunt's advice in order to gain some affection from the Emperor. Faced with this, Ziyu asked whether that meant that the family of the Marquis of the North had also been victims of a trap. However, Xiao Jinming quickly denied it. He explained that although he still had no concrete proof, the man was undoubtedly connected to the third royal uncle and also to the case involving Yun Yangbo. Yu Shu interjected into the conversation, carefully reading the notebook of confessions. She commented that even without being able to arrest the third uncle for now, it was still possible to have the Marquis arrested due to his wife's involvement with witchcraft inside the imperial harem. Upon hearing this, Xiao Jinming celebrated his sister-in-law's intelligence. However, she merely dismissed him with disdain, stating that he was no longer needed there. Upset, Xiao Jinming still tried to complain to his brother, but he was also sent away by him. So, with no other option, he ran off almost in tears, while the couple focused entirely on the notebook of confessions. With the mood turning more serious, the Empress reflected that the noble consort had placed all the blame on Jie Tao. Moreover, since some time had already passed since it all happened, the evidence had probably already been destroyed. All of that without even counting the fact that the Empress Dowager was still protecting the young woman. The girl remembered the concubine's arrogance, how she had challenged her, claiming that all of her efforts had been useless. Later, our girl looked worn out, while her husband asked the doctor what was wrong. After all, she was only going through her menstrual period, yet she complained of intense pain. To his surprise, the man revealed that it was not just that, but rather a case of poisoning. She had suddenly lost her strength earlier, when the two of them were still analyzing the confessions delivered by Xiao Jinming. Frightened, Xiao Jinyun rushed to help his wife and asked, in panic, what was happening. Groaning in pain and holding her own abdomen, Zhu asked that the imperial physician be summoned immediately. While they waited, the boy tried to understand the cause of it and asked whether Yu Shu suffered from any hidden illness, since she herself had said that she had not eaten anything cold that time. But he defended her right away, explaining that she used to exercise every day before the body swap. Then he raised another possibility, asking whether the Empress might have taken some tonic by mistake. Soon after, the doctor arrived at their quarters and began examining the woman's pulse carefully. His expression turned serious and thoughtful, which made Xiao Jinyun even more anxious. Unable to hold himself back, he asked how a simple menstruation could cause so much pain. However, kneeling before the two of them, the doctor revealed with a certain apprehension that the problem was not cold in the woman's womb or a common cramp. In truth, they were dealing with poisoning. Upon hearing this, Yu Shu was stunned and leaned against the Emperor's chest. In utter desperation, he shouted, questioning how this could have happened. The woman, on the other hand, was more concerned with knowing whether there was at least a cure for it. The doctor then explained that the poison was not fatal, but it caused severe damage to the body, making it almost impossible for her to become pregnant in the future. Upon hearing that she would have difficulty having children, Xiao Jinyun was completely devastated. At that instant, a childhood memory came to his mind, her shaping clay dolls in the garden. According to the little girl, they represented herself, Yu Shu, and the child she imagined having with the Emperor, and that made her face shine with such joy. Unlike her brother, who tried to take it lightly, At the time, her brother Zhenshu had even joked that she was not even married yet and was already talking about babies, only to be chased by the girl for making fun of something that was so serious to her. Back in the present, Yushu looked at her husband with extreme concern, until the doctor made a discreet signal to the couple, and the emperor summoned all the available maids, ordering them to bring all the foods, teas, and cosmetics that the empress usually used. Thus, the doctor began his analysis, but nothing caught his attention. He examined each item carefully until suddenly he sensed a suspicious fragrance coming from the incense burner. Upon testing the product on his own hands, he asked where that fragrance came from, which immediately raised an alarm for Xiao Jinyun. At that moment, all the maids knelt down, hiding their faces and maintaining a posture of shame. The empress then explained that she did not have the habit of burning incense, but had started doing so about 2 months earlier, because her husband liked the aroma. Hearing this, the emperor asked whether the problem was the incense. Nervous, the doctor began to answer, ready to confirm Xiao Jinyun's suspicions, who immediately realized that the problem lay entirely there. Without hesitation, he ordered all the subordinates to leave his quarters. When he and Yushu were finally alone, the empress stared at him firmly and demanded to know who had given him that incense. A heavy silence settled in the air before the emperor finally confessed. He had received it as a gift from the Empress Dowager the previous year. It was as if a mask had just fallen right in front of the woman. She moved away from the emperor, collapsing onto the bed without strength. Xiao Jinyun even tried to soften the situation, suggesting that it might all be a misunderstanding, and asked her to go speak with his mother personally. Shortly after, at the Empress Dowager's palace, the emperor was seated beside her as usual, but this time his tone was serious, until he finally found the courage to question her directly about the incense burner. The mention of the object wiped all the joy from her face. Then she dismissed the maid, and without beating around the bush, she admitted what she had done. Xiao Jinyun's eyes widened, for he had never imagined that his mother, his wife's mother-in-law, would be capable of something like that. Even so, he made an effort to remain calm and soon asked what her reason had been. Coldly, his mother replied that she had merely followed her own son's advice, who in the past feared that the power of the Shu family would fuel dangerous ambitions for the empire. Indignant, the man shouted to remind the woman that his wife was an empress, and that an empress without children would never have a secure position there. But the lady remained cold, and only told her son to remember the true reason for that marriage. He immediately retorted, saying that although he had not favored the empress before, doing something so cruel made absolutely no sense, and therefore she should stop any plan against Yushu. He finished by stating that the Shu family had never intended to usurp the throne. Faced with this, the Empress Dowager agreed to stop sending the incense, although there was not a shred of sincerity in her voice. Even so, she could not hide her strangeness upon noticing that he had only started using the incense now. She herself had even forgotten that she had given the gift to her daughter-in-law. The young man grew thoughtful for a moment, but then he replied as his wife would probably have replied if they had not switched bodies. Maybe she doesn't use it because it's very stupid. When the two talked in the bedroom at night, the girl tried to explain that she did not want to upset the widow, and that it had only been a misunderstanding. But the emperor only turned away, completely exhausted. The tightness in her chest was immediate. She even thought about touching the young man and saying something more, anything, but she hesitated at that very moment. In the end, she only placed a small doll on his pillow, as a silent apology. The next day, the young man apologized in a whisper while the woman was still asleep. Later, the empress sought out Luo Hanying alone, and with an expression heavy with irritation, she complained that Xiao Jinyun was distant once again, cold, as if nothing had changed. But Luo Hanying did not even raise his head, only continued writing whatever it was he was writing. And then he replied dryly that he was an official responsible for matters of state and astrology there, not someone in charge of resolving marital disputes, leaving Yushu even more stressed. She responded irritably, making it clear that she had not gone there to ask Luo Hanying to solve her marital problems, but rather that what truly worried her was the body swap between her and Xiao Jinyun, and that she needed to reverse it as soon as possible, before the confusion in the palace spiraled completely out of control. Faced with this, Luo Hanying finally interrupted his writing, revealing something the empress very much wanted to hear. He had already reached a conclusion about that whole mess. Then the advisor pulled a folded paper from inside his sleeve and extended it in front of her. Yushu took it, asking what it was. On the scroll were strange symbols, very similar to those carved on the voodoo doll found earlier, yet still different. Suddenly, the man pulled over a box with the doll inside, and in a calm tone, he explained that for the souls to return to their correct bodies, it would be necessary to make a special talisman. But for that, they would need an extremely rare ingredient, a treasure from the northern desert kingdom, known as the Soul Cord. Upon hearing those words, the Empress looked even more lost, but the advisor showed a drawing, identical to the one he had made, which was carved into the doll's casing, explaining that it had been made with the material they needed. Yushu crumpled the paper tightly, realizing that this went far beyond an intrigue within the harem. This time, there was someone very clever behind it all, someone willing to ally even with foreign powers. Stressed, she warned that the Desert Kingdom could not suspect anything about this plan, because if they realized that something was wrong with the Emperor, the consequences could be disastrous. While they were talking, Xiao Jinming was approaching the place in search of the advisor, but unintentionally, he ended up overhearing part of the conversation from behind the door, catching the part where the woman asked whether after that they could swap bodies back, and Luo Hanying answered that yes, but that the talisman had to be completed. The boy turned white as a sheet. Xiao Jinming was seized by panic, imagining that the two were secretly conspiring to overthrow the emperor. And because of that, the boy ran off, shouting that they were trying to perform a body swap between the emperor and the empress, accusing the two poor souls of rebellion. Xiao Jinyun, on the other hand, was distracted in the garden, trying to have a bit of peace. But it remained only an attempt, because he was basically run over by his brother, who could only shout and say that it was absurd. He had completely lost control and began yelling that the situation was extremely serious, that the palace was on the brink of a crisis, since the empress, together with the advisor, was plotting a betrayal to harm the emperor. Xiao Jinyun pushed the boy away, placing a hand on his shoulder in an attempt to restrain him, and then asked who he was talking about, to which he replied that he was talking about his wife and Luo Hanying, repeating that the two of them were planning to swap Yushu's body with Xiao Jinyun's through witchcraft. Seeing his brother so agitated like that made our boy a little worried about Xiao Jinming's mental state. When the poor man tried to change the subject, he was immediately cut off, because the young man jumped into his arms, insisting that this was no joke and that the two of them needed to be arrested immediately. After all, his wife wanted to turn him into a woman. In his mind, the spell they were planning would make his brother turn into a woman, while the empress would become a cruel man, one who would certainly condemn the real emperor to be thrown into the cold palace, forgotten and humiliated, while Xiao Jinming himself would be tortured for the rest of his days. All of this, while Yushu enjoyed an incredible future alongside the imperial advisor. Overcome with panic, Xiao Jinming even cried, imagining the miserable fate that awaited his brother. Fortunately, Xiao Jinyun had more sense, and seeing the state he was in, he tried to calm him down, saying that none of that made sense and that, above all, he needed to hear the truth about that whole madness. That was how the prince finally learned everything. Yushu even joined the two of them, having to deal with the still confused looks of the young man, trying to figure out who was who at that moment. When he finally understood the gravity of the situation, he took a few steps back, seized by panic, realizing that he had taken the empress herself to a brothel without ever suspecting the truth. Yushu immediately flew into a rage and said bluntly that she would still settle accounts with him over that. Terrified, Xiao Jinming did not think twice before clinging to Xiao Jinyun, asking for forgiveness over and over again, swearing that he would never have done something like that if he had known who she really was. Impatient, the emperor ordered the boy to pull himself together at once. The atmosphere between them was still tense, and the prince shifted his gaze between the two of them as if trying to see similarities and differences between them at that moment, until he let out a small laugh, commenting that now everything made sense, saying that he finally understood why the emperor's archery skills had improved so much, to the point of defeating the third uncle in public. Amid his laughter, the young man also remembered that his brother had always been terrible at archery, and that years ago, he had even lost a bet because of it, being forced to serve as a girlfriend for one of his friends. Yushu, her patience hanging by a thread, did not think twice before smacking him on the head. Xiao Jinming, however, kept grumbling that he was only telling the truth, even if he was not proud of it. Seeing that all of this would take a while, the emperor decided to sit down and let the two of them sort it out. He watched the little toy his wife had left on his pillow attentively, with a bit of sadness in his eyes. In the end, he always felt this lack of affection from his spouse. After the woman finally chased Xiao Jinming away, Xiao Jinyun caught her attention, and then, shifting his gaze to the little toy horse, he asked in a calm tone where it had come from, to which the girl replied that it was a gift from her older brother from the last visit she made to the Shu family. That made the boy smile faintly before asking whether she was trying to remind him that the girl's brothers and father were still on the front lines of the battlefield. Hearing that, Yu Shu hurried to deny any ulterior motive, saying that she was not insinuating anything. But Xiao Jinyun's expression grew even more serious when he said that she'd not need to worry about that. For, as a daughter of the Zhu family, she knew very well how military doctrine worked, and all she had ever heard was that they had to remain loyal to His Majesty and serve the nation with soul and heart. So, regardless of what happened, she would never try to harm him. His defensive reply worried Yushu, who stepped closer, making it clear that he had understood everything wrong. In truth, all she wanted was to cheer the young man up after the argument she had caused the day before. And above all, she wanted to see the Emperor truly happy. Xiao Jinyun was very surprised by those words, wondering silently whether she really cared about his happiness. He truly had not expected any of that from the woman. After all, when he was in his normal body, things were very different. Even so, the young man replied coldly, only apologizing for his attitude. The silence in the room was deafening. They stared at each other with sadness and resentment over everything that had already happened in that relationship, until the Empress firmly took her husband's hand. And frowning at his response, she asked whether, in his eyes, she was really someone so despicable. Xiao Jinyun pulled his hand away immediately, and he looked away, trying to maintain an indifferent posture before apologizing in case he had judged her unfairly. In response, the girl only sighed deeply, and with more patience than she usually had, explained that they needed a rare item from the desert in order to reverse the body swap. She also said that she would send a secret order to General Shu to look for it. Hiding his little pet in his clothes again, Xiao Jinyun said that his wife did not need to tell him her plans. That was enough to make Yushu lose her temper, slamming her hand on the table. She questioned who she was supposed to tell then, and she decided to risk asking whether, if she swore that she knew nothing about the incense, he would believe her word. However, to her sadness, Xiao Jinyun answered in an almost mechanical way, saying that he would believe anything that Your Majesty said. Those words hit Yushu hard. A tightness seized her chest when she realized that he was becoming completely submissive, erased from who he was, just like the other concubines in the palace, and that bothered her more than she wanted to admit. Normally, the Emperor used to hate that noisy way of his wife, but now that she was in his body, she only acted in a docile and quiet manner, like a lifeless marionette. In a sudden and determined gesture, she grabbed her husband's hand, startling the poor man, and then placed it over her own chest, saying that she would only say this once. Her reaction left Xiao Jinyun confused and very curious, until finally the girl admitted that she had always been cautious regarding the Shu family, but guaranteed that she had never thought of hurting him or harming their own child. Even already accustomed to the soul swap, Xiao Jinyun felt a chill run through his body. The situation felt far too strange, so he asked the woman to calm down and to remove her hand from his chest. But before he could say anything else, the door suddenly opened. The chief eunuch entered and came face to face with a scene far too intimate for palace standards. In an exaggerated reflex, he covered his eyes with his sleeves, leaving the air heavy with embarrassment. Noticing his presence there, Yushu's face turned as red as a tomato from shame, while her husband covered his face with his hand in a failed attempt to hide. They finally separated, overwhelmed by the embarrassment, until the girl finally broke the silence and asked what was going on. The eunuch, still without the courage to look at the scene, quickly explained that the Empress Dowager had summoned the girl. She promptly dismissed him, saying that she would soon go meet her mother-in-law. As soon as he left, Yushu looked at her husband, who seemed startled by her gaze. Then she pulled him closer and, affectionately, explained that she might return to sign a secret decree and wanted to know whether he would like to send any message to his father along with the document. Hearing that, the young man completely forgot the previous grievances and almost jumped with joy. In addition, the Empress also added that if he wanted to send food or clothes to the old man, he only needed to ask and she would take care of it. Her words were like music to Xiao Jinyun's ears, and he eagerly went to arrange the things he would send, while she merely watched him from a distance, commenting to herself that he behaved like an innocent child. At the Palace of Peace and Benevolence, Xiao Jinming was sitting there devouring his food without the slightest care. Meanwhile, the Empress Dowager, full of affection, wiped his mouth as if he were still a child. But suddenly, Yushu entered the room, startling the poor man. He even choked, turning red and making his mother desperate as she tried to get some water so the food would go down. Xiao Jinming even tried to slip away discreetly, saying that it was better for his sister-in-law and his mother to stay alone. But he was held by the shoulder. With a not at all reassuring smile, the Empress Dowager warned that the matter also concerned him. She turned to her daughter-in-law with disdain, commenting that there were specific flowers in the garden that had just bloomed and that she should hurry to make a bouquet out of them. But Yushu, already immediately understanding the intentions behind the idea, casually remarked that perhaps it was already time for Xiao Jinming to think about marriage, and she could even help with that. Of course, the Empress Dowager took advantage of her comment to needle her, saying that she seemed to be getting even smarter lately. The prince, on the other hand, fell into complete despair because he did not want to get married yet, much less become part of that whole circus his mother had created around his love life. Yushu, however, pretended not to notice, deliberately ignoring the young man as a small punishment for having taken the Empress in her original body to a brothel. The poor man was indignant and could not believe that his brother would really do that. But the one who truly found this situation strange was the Empress Dowager, who had no idea about her son's body swap. To her, the exchange of glances between the two indicated a possible flirtation, and that was inadmissible there. Later, upon meeting his sister-in-law in his brother's body, Xiao Jinming practically threw himself at Xiao Jinyun's feet, kneeling and begging for help. He said, almost in tears, that he absolutely did not want to go on a blind date. Seen that way, he looked like a little puppy that had fallen off the moving cart, but Xiao Jinyun tried to calm him down, speaking patiently as he asked what was so bad about a simple meeting, suggesting that he choose someone he genuinely liked so he could avoid being forced to marry a completely unbearable stranger. However, Xiao Jinming only made a face and complained that all noble young ladies were far too delicate, far too well-mannered, and utterly boring. That made Xiao Jinyun think for a moment before suggesting that he choose the daughter of some general. It was exactly at that moment that a third person interrupted them, making it clear that they were no different from noble women. It was the Empress, who, with an ironic little smile, explained that the two of them were expecting too much from women, and that not all of them were like Yushu. This made Xiao Jinyun visibly awkward. She warned her husband that since the flower banquet would be the next day, he would have to go to court alone. But Xiao Jinyun made it clear that this was no longer a problem for him. He was already quite used to this comfortable life as emperor. The next day, however, the atmosphere changed completely. During court, Xiao Jinyun received an urgent report from the northwest informing him that the Huns had invaded the border, and that the army had suffered 2 consecutive defeats. In addition, General Shu was still recovering from his injuries, and without him, Marshal Shu would hardly stand a chance. An older official took advantage of the situation to suggest that the commander be replaced, claiming that Commander Shu was already too old to lead the troops. But another general tried to defend him, saying that victories and defeats were relative. Then, he handed a document to the emperor for him to sign, saying that it was a proposal for someone else to immediately take General Shu's place. Upon hearing that, the soul of Xiao Jinyun, the son of that commander, boiled with indignation. Unable to contain himself, he threw the report at the man and shouted that changing command in the middle of a war was a fatal mistake. His reaction left the other officials somewhat surprised. The minister and the general were still perplexed when Xiao Jinyun bellowed that he would never approve something so absurd. Soon, one of the officials bowed before the young man's throne, saying that it was a brilliant decision. And it did not take long for others to do the same. In support, one of them recalled that this time, the Tartars and the Huns had attacked at the same time, unlike other occasions, so it would be difficult for anyone to face them. While another praised Marshal Shu, despite his advanced age, commenting that his decision to retreat a bit to another city had been a great move. Yet another spoke up, lamenting that General Shu could not return to the battlefield, but volunteering to support his son regardless of anything. Observing the court's reaction, Xiao Jinyun realized the weight of his father's reputation, something he had definitely not expected to see. Then he made a decision, drawing the attention of everyone present. He explained that the security of the capital was just as important as the war happening in the northwest, ordering General Chen to stop speaking and declaring with authority that it would be he himself who would decide who would be sent to the battlefield, and finally ordered the officials to pay attention before instructing them to plan the dispatch of more troops and provisional armies to the front lines in the northwest. Thus, he withdrew to his chambers. He was trying to ponder what to do, since there were few truly capable military men available, given that Yu Shu had always given preference to the training of civil officials. But his thoughts were interrupted. The situation grew even heavier when Yu Shu's older brother appeared in the hall, accompanied by his brother. He was pale, visibly injured, yet still asked to go to war. Sweating coldly and barely able to remain standing, Jun Shu insisted on kneeling before the emperor, who looked at him with concern, before shouting and questioning whether this was some kind of joke, since he was clearly injured. His brother even tried to argue that Xiao Jinyun was right, offering to go in his place, but he was soon interrupted by the warrior, who assured that his brother was braver than he was strategic. Mid-sentence, his body gave out and he nearly fell because of his injuries. Desperate, Xiao Jinyun ran to hold him and, without realizing it, called him out loud, "Brother," which caused a brief moment of strangeness in the warrior. Trying to remain firm, the emperor made it clear that he could not even assume the position of general. Moreover, if he accepted that absurd proposal, what would happen if he failed? So, the young man said that he needed time to think. As the two were leaving, the second brother commented in a somewhat bitter tone that if their little sister had been born a man, she would be a better general than he was. But he was soon reprimanded by Junshu. Those words ignited a spark in Xiao Jinyun's mind. Suddenly, he realized something that was obvious. Now she was in the emperor's body. That meant she could go to the battlefield personally. Without wasting time, he ran off to look for his wife and talk to her about this possibility. Meanwhile, the poor girl was surrounded by suitors for her brother-in-law, who had already proven himself to be utterly useless. Completely bored at the flower banquet she was now forced to attend. She called one of her maids to ask where on earth Xiao Jinming was, only to receive a fearful look from the woman who explained that he had refused to go to the event. Poor Yu Shu stood up angrily because she could not believe that the boy had actually done such a thing. On the other side of the palace, by the edge of the lake, the boy was staring sadly at the fish. It did not take long for his sister-in-law to find him, and she did not mince words before telling him to swallow his tears and stop the drama, and finally go meet the Empress Dowager. But the boy kept whining like a spoiled child, saying that he had not finished feeding the fish yet, and therefore could not go. But the woman only said that he needed to stop feeding the fish because they were already about to burst. She did not even wait for the boy's response, simply grabbing his hand without the slightest patience and dragging him toward the hall. However, the two of them had no idea that the noble concubine had been there the whole time, hidden behind a rock, observing the interaction, which was strange to say the least, between the two. When the two finally arrived at the banquet, Yao Sao greeted his mother with the greatest brazenness. But inwardly, facing those women, he wondered what he was supposed to be doing there. After all, he could not simply flirt with aristocrats' daughters because that was improper in the empire, so he merely stiffened his expression as a precaution. However, the announcement of his brother's arrival at the place made him jump. Xiao Jinyun was also a bit surprised, as he had completely forgotten about the party that was going on. A little awkwardly, the young man apologized for the intrusion, explaining that he needed to speak with the Empress immediately. He did not even let Yu Shu object, just grabbed her hand and pulled her along. While the young ladies melted, thinking that the two must love each other very much to be together like that. Xiao Jinming, on the other hand, could only watch the couple leave in despair, because now he would have to deal with that whole circus alone. Just facing that crowd of women desperate to marry him already made him break out in a cold sweat. So, in a desperate move, the prince called out to Xiao Jinyun, asking whether he was going to discuss the matter from court earlier, something the emperor confirmed, causing Xiao Jinming to tug at his clothes to stop his brother and reveal that he had something to say about it. His eyes showed the nervousness he was feeling. He was willing to do anything to get out of there as quickly as possible. Trying to help, the boy finally called the prince to accompany him, leaving Xiao Jinming happier than a pig in mud. The Empress Dowager released him without the slightest resistance because she truly believed it was something important. Only the infatuated young ladies lamented the departure of the stallion. If they knew the truth, they would have run out of there to avoid wasting any more time. As soon as the three were alone, Yu Shu asked how her brother-in-law knew about the matter discussed in court that morning. The shameless guy was already eating a slice of watermelon when he was caught off guard by the question, revealing that he actually knew nothing at all. She was already ready to argue when Xiao Jinyun intervened and said that Xiao Jinming did not want to get married right now, but that given time, it would happen at the right moment. What mattered now was the matter they needed to discuss. After the girl read the war report informing them of the invasion by the Huns and the loss of 2 battles, her expression was one of complete shock. Her husband intervened, explaining that the Empire's troops could defeat the Huns or the Tartars' troops without much trouble. The problem was that if the two joined forces against them, the army would not be able to do much. Nervous, Yu Shu declared that they should send more troops to the front lines. However, the emperor made it clear that the problems were far too great to be solved with brute force alone. According to him, what they needed were capable generals, because without good leadership, they stood no chance at all. And finally, he says that he himself would like to go to the battlefield to fight for his nation. As soon as he heard that, Xiao Jinming spat out his tea on the spot, and Yu Shu, who had already been writing her request for more troops, dropped the brush in complete shock. Even so, Xiao Jinyun firmly explained the critical condition of his brother, recalling how Junshu had left his chambers trying to suppress his groans of pain. As for his other brother, he had more courage than intelligence. But Yu Shu insisted on questioning about the other generals. Was it really only the Shu family that could fight? Reminding him that their father had trained true military talents over the years. Hesitantly, Xiao Jinyun pulled a piece of paper from his clothes before beginning to explain that 3 years ago, General Yongwu had died on the battlefield, leaving his title to his son, who at the time was less than 6 years old. 2 years ago, he continued, General Zhao received an order and had to leave the front lines to go to prison. Nowadays, one of his legs barely functioned. Just 1 year ago, General Yang led his troops into Gobi territory, but they ran out of supplies and starved to death at Mount Tang. The Empress was terrified by that information, questioning her husband as to why he had not been informed about the lack of food among the troops. To which Xiao Jinyun explained that the military were generally terrible at communication, so they decided to ignore what was happening. Moreover, the civil officials would love to pin a defeat on them, so they kept quiet. She swallowed hard. She knew she had made terrible choices in the past, and now she had received the greatest confirmation of that. Her husband approached, explaining seriously that it was easy to form an army with thousands of soldiers, but extremely difficult to obtain even a single good general. And he reminded her that, by luck or misfortune, the two had switched bodies, and therefore he wanted to go resolve everything with his own hands. But that would be quite an event for the empire, and besides, Yu Shu did not even know who would take care of the nation in her absence. That was when he had a great idea. Xiao Jinming could stay in his place in the meantime. But the idea did not please the freeloader in the slightest, who panicked completely just imagining the workload ahead of him, immediately rejecting that crazy idea of theirs. Yu Shu, on the other hand, was seriously considering it. The desperate prince went to complain to Luo Hanying, grumbling that his sister-in-law, in his brother's body, had decided to go to war and asked him to take care of the empire, and that his brother had even supported her. But the man only said that there did not seem to be anything wrong with that plan, and Xiao Jinming found an opening to ask whether the two of them should not worry about the possibility of him seizing all the power for himself. Something Luo Hanying knew did not even have the slightest chance of happening. He dipped the brush and quickly painted the boy's nose, mocking the absurdity of what he had suggested. He knew the prince was far too innocent to do something like that. Seeing him so relaxed made the boy blush instantly. He really did look like a child. Meanwhile, at the Palace of Benevolence and Peace, the news of her son's departure made the Empress Dowager drop her tea. She argued that the boy had never been good at archery or horse riding, so by going to war like that, he was practically signing his own death certificate. To try to convince the Empress Dowager, Xiao Jinyun followed to the letter a script he had prepared before going to his mother's chamber together with his wife. Calmly, he explained that his skills with the bow and on horseback had improved greatly in recent times. He had even used them during the autumn hunt. When he finished speaking, he even checked whether that was really all that was written on the cue sheet. His mother thought for a moment, but before she could say anything, the young man explained that he had asked Xiao Jinming to supervise the affairs of the empire in his absence, making it clear that he had the ability to do what he was proposing. And he further argued that his nation was suffering direct aggression from foreigners in battle, and that only he and General Shu could stand against the other troops, so having an emperor personally lead the army would be the best choice, adding that if they won, they would guarantee at least 10 years of peace for the empire. That last part was not in the speech he had prepared with Yu Shu, which made him a little insecure. He knew that if he said anything wrong, his chances of fighting would be gone. However, to his luck, the woman stood up, deeply moved, fully agreeing with him, saying that the emperor of the Xiao family had to be a real man, and that was exactly why she would give her authorization for her son to go, which left him euphoric. If he were being honest, he had not thought he would manage to convince the Empress Dowager to support his plan. That's it, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. The story is called No Doubt in Us, and this time I covered up to chapter 69 so you'd have plenty of content to binge and enjoy. Honestly, I loved the interaction between the two leads. That constant tension? So good. Even with all the misunderstandings, in the end they actually grow as people, and you can really feel the romance slowly starting to bloom. At the same time, this story is all about understanding the other person's pain, but it delivers that in a light, fun, and sometimes chaotic way, which makes it even better. I really hope this romance starts moving a bit faster though, because I'm low-key suffering here. Drop your theories in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Kisses and see you next time.